somewhere in one of the most remote and inhospitable corners of the planet, in a desert so dry it barely qualifies as part of the same world you and I live in, archaeologists pulling back layers of sand and time found something that didn't make sense. Bodies. Extraordinarily well-preserved bodies. People who had been lying there for 3, 4, even 4,000 years, their skin still intact, their hair still coloured, their features still readable as faces rather than fragments. That alone would be remarkable. But then the scientists ran the DNA, and the story got genuinely strange. The genetic results didn't match the populations you'd expect to find in that part of ancient China. They didn't match East Asian lineages. They didn't match populations from the surrounding regions that researchers had assumed, based on geography alone, must have been the source. The closest matches led somewhere else entirely, to a ghost population, a group so ancient and so isolated that their closest known relatives weren't living people at all, but other ancient remains scattered across thousands of miles and thousands of years of human prehistory. A population that had essentially vanished from everywhere else, somehow preserved in this one buried pocket at the edge of the known world. Think about what that would mean for a moment. Every time we rewrite the story of how humans spread across the planet, we're not just updating a textbook, we're asking a deeper question about who we are and how the world we live in came to look the way it does. Migration routes that seemed settled get reopened. Contacts between distant cultures that seemed impossible get reconsidered. The timelines we use to explain the spread of languages, technologies and ideas all get shuffled like a deck of cards that was never quite in the right order to begin with. The place is the Tarim Basin, a vast depression in what is now the Xinjiang region of western China. You may not have heard of it, but if you've ever studied a map of the ancient Silk Road, your eyes have passed over it. It sits between mountain ranges that reach toward the sky like walls built to keep the world out. The Taklamakan Desert fills much of its interior, and the name of that desert has sometimes been translated, perhaps a little dramatically, as you go in but you don't come out. The translation is disputed, but the sentiment is not entirely wrong. This is one of the driest places on Earth. Summer temperatures push above 40 degrees Celsius. Winter drops well below freezing. Sandstorms can erase landmarks, bury roads, swallow entire cities. For most of human history, this was not a place people chose. It was a place people passed through carefully or avoided entirely. And yet people lived there. People were buried there. And because of that extraordinary dryness, because of a combination of salt, cold, and almost complete absence of moisture, those people were preserved in a way that defies every intuition you have about what happens to a body after 4,000 years in the ground. What we're going to follow across this story is a trail of evidence that builds piece by piece. The bodies themselves and what they look like up close, the grave goods buried alongside them, and what those objects suggest about where their makers had been, who they had known, what traditions they were carrying when they arrived. The environment that held all of this together long enough for science to catch up. And then, finally, the genetics, the molecular story written inside the cells of people who died long before any civilization we'd recognize as familiar had fully taken shape. Each layer of that evidence has, at various points, pointed somewhere different. Researchers have proposed connections to cultures in Europe, to groups in Central Asia, to populations on the Eurasian steppe, to Bronze Age peoples whose traces show up thousands of miles away. Some of those proposals have held up, some have not. The genetic results we'll get to later in this story are among the most carefully studied and most surprising in the entire field of ancient DNA research, and they raised questions that the scientific community is still actively working through. This is not a story with a tidy ending. It's a story about how the further back you look, the more complicated the human family tree becomes, and how sometimes the most isolated, most forgotten corner of the world turns out to be exactly where history hid something it didn't want us to find too quickly. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and let me know where you are in the world and what time it is where you're sitting. I check those comments more than you might think, and there's something genuinely moving about knowing that people in different corners of the planet are all following the same thread of ancient mystery at the same moment. It connects us in a way that feels oddly appropriate for a story about how connected the ancient world already was, long before we had words for any of it. Now, let's start at the beginning, with the desert, and with what it does to time. Picture a bowl, an enormous one, roughly the size of France, ringed on three sides by mountain ranges that rank among the tallest on Earth. To the north, the Tian Shan, to the south, the Kunlun, to the west, the Pamirs. These aren't gentle hills. They're walls of stone and ice that block weather systems, trap cold air, and intercept almost every drop of moisture that might otherwise reach the interior. The result is the Taklamakan Desert, sitting in the center of that bowl, and it is one of the driest places on the planet. Annual rainfall in much of the basin measures in single-digit millimeters. Some years, none falls at all. This is the Tarim Basin, and its geography alone tells you why it mattered. Sit with a map for a moment. To the east is China's heartland. To the west, the routes that lead into Central Asia, toward Persia, and eventually the Mediterranean. To the north, the Eurasian steppe, that vast corridor of grassland stretching from Hungary all the way to Mongolia, the highway that nomadic peoples would ride for thousands of years. The Tarim sits at the junction of all of these worlds. It is not a place at the edge of things. It is, if you draw the lines correctly, almost exactly a center, a crossroads between civilizations that didn't yet know they were civilizations. Anything moving between east and west, between steppe and settled world, had a way of being shaped by this basin, either passing around it at enormous cost, or threading through the oases that cling to its edges where glacier meltwater reaches the desert floor. And yet the interior, the deep desert, was another matter entirely. The Taklamakan sand dunes can rise to heights of 300 meters. Storms move them. Seasons shift them. Cities that were thriving trade posts in one century can be buried under meters of sand a few generations later. Archaeologists working in this region don't excavate so much as they chase. The desert reveals and conceals on its own schedule, indifferent to what researchers need. Now here's what that extreme environment does to a body. When a person dies in most parts of the world, decomposition begins almost immediately. Bacteria, moisture, insects, oxygen, all of them go to work. Within weeks, soft tissue is gone. Within years, depending on soil chemistry, even bone can begin to break down. The process is so reliable that forensic scientists use it to estimate time of death. The biology of rot is well understood precisely because it almost always happens. In the Tarim Basin, something different occurs. The air is so dry that moisture leaves the body faster than bacteria can establish the conditions they need to work. Salt in the soil draws out remaining fluids and acts as a natural preservative, the same principle behind centuries of salting meat for storage. Temperature swings between brutal summer heat and bitter winter. Cold essentially freeze dry the tissues over time, creating a stable environment where decay stalls and then stops. The result is preservation that can last thousands of years without any human intervention at all. This is the critical distinction to draw here. When most people hear the word mummy, they think of ancient Egypt, of deliberate embalming, of priests removing organs, packing cavities with natron, wrapping bodies in careful linen. That process was intentional. It was ritual. It was labor-intensive. The mummies of the Tarim Basin are something else. Nobody prepared these bodies for preservation in that way. They were buried. The desert did the rest. Natural mummification, driven by climate and soil chemistry, not ceremony. That difference matters because it tells us the preservation isn't a cultural artifact. It's an accident of geography that we happen to be lucky enough to find. The key cemetery regions that have drawn the most attention are clustered along the basin's edges, where those glacier-fed oases made settled life possible. Churchen, known today as Kiemo, in the southeast. Lulan, near the dried-out bed of what was once a substantial lake called Lop Nor. Subeshi, further north. And perhaps most importantly the site of Xiaohe, sometimes called the Small River Cemetery, a place so remote that it was found by a Swedish explorer in the early 20th century, then lost again under the dunes, then rediscovered decades later. These locations aren't random. They follow the logic of survival in a desert. Settlements clung to water sources, and the dead were buried nearby. Dating these sites has been its own challenge, and it's worth pausing on why. In a landscape where dunes migrate and wind erosion constantly reshapes the surface, stratigraphy, the layering of soil that archaeologists normally use to establish relative age, becomes unreliable. Objects can be redeposited, graves can be exposed and reburied. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials provides more solid footing, but even that method has margins of error that matter when you're trying to place people within a specific century of a specific millennium. The current consensus, built from multiple rounds of careful dating, places the oldest remains at roughly 4,000 years ago, sometime around 2000 BCE, with occupation of the region continuing through the Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age, perhaps as late as 200 BCE. That's a span of nearly 2,000 years of human presence in one of the harshest environments on Earth. 2,000 years of people living at the edge of a desert that barely wanted them there, burying their dead in ways that, it turns out, the desert would hold on to far longer than anyone expected. And when the desert finally started giving some of those bodies back, the people who looked at what emerged from the sand realized fairly quickly that they were looking at something that didn't fit any easy explanation. The first documented encounters with these bodies weren't dramatic laboratory discoveries. They were moments of confusion, reported almost as footnotes by explorers who were in the region for entirely different reasons. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Tarim Basin attracted a particular kind of traveller. European and Russian imperial expeditions were pushing into Central Asia, mapping routes, cataloguing resources, hunting for manuscripts and antiquities that could be shipped back to institutions in London, St. Petersburg, Berlin, Paris. The great game was playing out across this part of the world, and archaeology was often indistinguishable from geopolitical intelligence gathering. Aurel Stein, the Hungarian-British archaeologist, made multiple expeditions into the basin between 1900 and 1930, finding textiles, wooden documents, and fragmentary human remains at sites like Lulan and Nia. Sven Hedin, the Swedish explorer, crossed the Taklamakan multiple times, and it was one of his guides who first reported the existence of Xiaohe, the site that would later produce some of the most remarkable finds of the entire saga. These early accounts filtered back to Western audiences, often buried in expedition reports that few people read, and what details they included about the human remains tended toward the brief and the puzzled. The faces, where preserved, didn't match what the explorers expected to find in a region bordering Western China, but expectations are a dangerous thing in archaeology, and for decades the expectations held. Political circumstances cut the research off before it could develop any momentum. The region that is now Xinjiang, the administrative territory occupying much of the Tarim Basin, changed hands and governance multiple times through the 20th century. After 1949, the newly established People's Republic of China effectively closed the area to independent foreign research. Soviet expeditions had already been curtailed. The window that had briefly opened for Western scholars slammed shut. The bodies that had been glimpsed were left in a kind of intellectual limbo. There were reports, photographs in some cases, sketches, but no sustained scientific access. Knowledge about what the desert was holding stayed fragmentary, second-hand, difficult to evaluate. What changed was a slow opening that began in the 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s and early 1990s, as Chinese archaeologists and a handful of permitted foreign collaborators were able to work more systematically at the cemetery sites. The Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region Museum in Urumqi became the repository for the most significant finds, and it was there that the mummies started to get the kind of close attention that transforms a curiosity into a scientific problem. And once you were standing in front of them, the visual impact was immediate and difficult to rationalize away. The body known informally as the Beauty of Lulan, excavated in 1980, was roughly 3,800 years old. She had been buried wrapped in a woolen cape fastened with bone pins, a woven basket near her body, grain and plant material that had survived alongside her in the dry air. None of that was especially startling. Burial goods are expected. What stopped people was her face. High cheekbones, a long nose, reddish-brown hair visible beneath her felt cap. Features that looked, to almost every observer who encountered her, distinctly European. Not Central Asian in the way that Chinese archaeologists of the period understood Central Asian. Not Mongoloid, to use the older typological language that was still common in physical anthropology at the time, something else entirely. Similar reactions greeted the excavation of the Churchian man, a towering individual found in the 1980s at the cemetery near Kiemo, wrapped in a long woolen robe of reddish fabric with a complex geometric pattern woven into it. He measured well over 6 feet tall. His hair was reddish-brown, his face finely preserved, and the features that emerged from the desiccated skin struck observers as unmistakably Western Eurasian in character. Beside him were the bodies of women and a small infant, all similarly preserved, all with the same visually anomalous appearance. The infant's face had been painted with small symbols, possibly ochre. The tenderness of that detail was striking, and so was the clothing. Tartans, plaid weave patterns in multiple colours that researchers found almost eerily reminiscent of fabric traditions associated with Bronze Age Europe. This is where the visual impression started to build its own momentum, and that momentum was not always helpful, because visible physical features, especially on ancient mummified remains, are not a reliable guide to population origin. Hair colour and facial structure can suggest broad affinities, but they're also subject to the observer's own expectations and cultural framings. When the first news reports about these mummies reached Western audiences in the early 1990s, the story almost immediately began accumulating interpretations that ran ahead of the evidence. The word Celtic appeared in newspaper headlines, despite no serious archaeologist endorsing that specific connection. The mummies became a canvas onto which people projected whatever theory they found compelling. European pioneers, lost tribes, prehistoric wanderers who had somehow reached the heart of Asia, thousands of years before any attested contact between East and West. Some of those theories served particular political agendas, with different groups claiming the mummies as evidence for various narratives about the deep history of the region's populations. That dimension was never far from the surface, and it complicated the science. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground was creating its own problems. The remote desert cemeteries, once their existence became more widely known, attracted looters. The economic incentive was real. Intact Bronze Age textiles, wooden artifacts, and well-preserved organic materials commanded prices on the antiquities market. Sites were disturbed before proper excavation could occur. Objects ended up in private collections and foreign institutions without documentation of their archaeological context, which is to say without the information that makes them scientifically useful. A mummy without context is a curiosity. A mummy within a documented burial associated with datable materials, measured and mapped within its cemetery, is a source of genuine historical knowledge. Looting systematically converts the second thing into the first. What the scientific community needed, and what the visual drama of the early reports was making harder to achieve, was patience. The kind of careful, systematic excavation that builds a picture you can actually trust. And there was one more layer of patience required beyond standard archaeological method. Because the questions these bodies were raising could not be answered by looking at them. Not really. The answers were going to have to come from the inside, from the biology embedded in the tissues themselves, from technology that, in the early years of discovery, didn't yet exist in the form that would eventually change everything. Stand this close to a body that's been dead for nearly 4,000 years and your brain has to do a double take. The skin is there. Not the soft, elastic surface you know from the living, but a tightened parchment, pulled taut over bone, darkened by time and salts and dust. The lips have shrunk back, the eyelids are sealed or half collapsed, but there is still a recognizable human face looking back at you. Not a skull, a person. In the dry air of the Tarim Basin, the fine details survive in ways that feel almost indecent. Individual eyebrow hairs, the faint trace of eyelashes, lines in the lips, wrinkles in the corners of the eyes. You can see age etched into the skin the way you might read rings in a tree. Deep furrows across the forehead of an older man, fine crow's feet around the eyes of a woman who may have smiled a lot in life, or squinted against the brightness of desert sun and snow-reflecting mountains. Hair is one of the most striking things here. It keeps its shape, often its colour. Braids lie where they were placed before burial. Beards have a trim line. Many observers commented on the shades: blondish, sandy brown, auburn, reddish. It was tempting from the very beginning to take those colours at face value, to treat them as uncomplicated signals of ancestry. But even hair can mislead you. Pigments break down. The same chemical changes that make modern corpses sometimes lighten over time can affect ancient ones too. A brunette can look chestnut after centuries of oxidation. Iron in the soil can shift tones. Bleaching from intense unfiltered UV light can lift colour over hundreds of seasons. When you're standing over a mummy, the precise shade you're looking at is not necessarily the shade someone saw in life. Facial features can lie in subtler ways. Desiccation changes contours, cheeks hollow, cartilage shrinks, lips thin. The nose, especially, doesn't always represent the original architecture. Cartilage collapses, skin tightens, the angle shifts. A long, narrow nose on a mummy doesn't map cleanly onto the same shape in a living person. Yet early accounts described these faces as clearly European, based largely on that first, visceral impression. Modern physical anthropologists are more cautious. You can take measurements, compare cranial indices, orbital shapes, dental traits. You can place individuals within broad morphological ranges, but what you get from that is probability, not a passport. And in this particular case, those visual impressions would soon collide with genetic evidence that told a far stranger story than Europeans showed up early. If the faces pull you in, the clothing keeps you there. The bodies from the Tarim cemeteries are wrapped, layered, dressed with an attention to fabric that would impress any textile historian. Wool dominates, not the coarse, scratchy material you might associate with primitive cloth, but in many cases fine, evenly spun threads woven with skill. You see twill weaves, plain weaves, even complex checked and plaid patterns built by alternating coloured yarns in precise sequences. These patterns matter. A tartan is not just an aesthetic choice, it's a technological statement. It tells you the weavers understood how to manage multiple colours on a loom, how to keep tension even, how to plan a design that repeats predictably. It tells you something about taste, about identity, about the amount of labour a community could afford to spend on clothes that were more than strictly utilitarian. Materials tell their own story. Microscopic analysis of the fibres shows that most of these textiles are made from the wool of domesticated sheep, with variations in fibre thickness that hint at intentional breeding for finer coats. In some cases, there are traces of plant fibres as well, likely flax, used for cords or lighter garments. You can slice out a thread, put it under a microscope and see twist directions, Z-twist, S-twist, that link these fabrics to wider technological traditions across Eurasia, where patterns offer a quieter, more intimate glimpse of daily life. Look at the soles of woolen boots from Tarim graves, and you'll often see reinforcement where the foot meets the stirrup would be. Except these people predate stirrups. Instead, you see extra layers at the heel and ball of the foot, the points that grind against ground and saddle. You can read gait in those frayed edges. Someone who walked long distances, someone who rode frequently. Elbows and knees in robes show thinning where fabric bent and rubbed. Cuffs are worn where hands moved in and out. Some clothes have careful mending, patching that suggests these garments were valuable enough to repair repeatedly, not disposable. Burial outfits can be deceptive. People are often buried in special clothes, but the repairs, the dirt embedded in hems, the grease-darkened collars on some tunics say many of these were used in life before they were used in death. The grave becomes a frozen fashion snapshot, but with enough broken threads to remind you these weren't costumes. They were part of routine existence in a harsh environment. And then there's the biological record of that existence, written in places you might not think to look. Open a jaw and the teeth speak loudly. Many of the Tarim mummies show heavy dental wear. molars ground almost flat, enamel polished and thinned. That's what happens when you eat a lot of unrefined grains or flour milled on stone. Tiny particles of grit work like sandpaper. In some mouths you can see distinct cupped depressions, where a particular tooth has been used repetitively for a specific motion, chewing tough, fibrous food, or maybe using the teeth as a third hand, holding leather or cord while it's worked. Cavities are there, but not everywhere. High rates of caries would point to a sugar-rich diet. Lower rates paired with extreme wear suggest cereals and dairy rather than large amounts of fruit or refined carbohydrates. Microscopic traces of calculus, hardened plaque, can preserve tiny plant remains caught in the tartar, bits of cereal starch, fragments of wild seeds, sometimes even pollen grains. Under a microscope, those specks can tell you which plants ended up between these people's teeth. Hair, meanwhile, is like a long, thin archive of the body's chemistry. Each centimetre reflects roughly a month of growth, layered with whatever isotopes of carbon and nitrogen the person's diet supplied at that time. Cut a lock, analyse it segment by segment, and you can see seasonal shifts. Higher signatures of animal protein in some months, lower in others. Periods that look like nutritional stress when the isotopic values swing abruptly. That suggests times of scarcity or changing access to herds and crops. In a few cases, stomach contents and intestinal residues survived well enough to analyse. The picture that emerges is consistent. A diet centred on millet and wheat, supplemented by meat and dairy, with occasional wild plants. You might find millet husks still in the digestive tract, or the ghost of milk proteins absorbed into dental calculus. You can't reconstruct a full menu, but you can sketch the outlines of a food system, pastoral and agricultural, not purely one or the other. Of course, bodies don't just record what people ate and wore. They record what people did, what hurt, what broke, what healed. Look at the skeleton beneath the skin and patterns jump out. Vertebrae with compressed spaces and bony outgrowths, evidence of chronic spinal stress. That can come from carrying heavy loads over long distances, or from riding for years with poor shock absorption. Knees and hips show osteoarthritis in older individuals, the kind of wear you expect in people whose daily lives involved walking, climbing, bending. Some shoulder joints are remodeled in ways that suggest repeated throwing or lifting, maybe from using spears, bows, or heavy tools. Healed fractures are common, ribs that broke and mended at angles, forearm bones with evidence of defensive injuries, classic parry fractures that happen when you raise an arm to block a blow. Skulls sometimes bear depressions where blunt force struck and the bone partly caved in, then healed. Not all injuries were survived. A few skeletons show lethal trauma, unhealed, the final event written directly into bone, an embedded arrowhead, a skull split by a sharp weapon, a chest wound that didn't have time to remodel. Pathologies tell you about health beyond trauma. Signs of chronic infection in the bones of the jaw, probably from untreated dental abscesses. Pitting on the inside of skulls that can signal anemia in childhood, maybe from nutritional stress or disease. Fused vertebrae in one individual hinting at a severe spinal condition, yet the joints around them show remodeling that suggests years of living with that disability, not a quick decline. All of this material, faces, fabrics, food traces, injuries, tempts you to build narratives, to imagine specific lives. The tall man with spine damage who maybe spent his later years directing work rather than doing it. The woman with heavily worn kneecaps and hands who may have ground grain daily, hour after hour for decades. The child with healed fractures who clearly received enough care to survive serious accidents. You can cautiously tell these kinds of stories. What you can't safely do is jump from the colour of someone's hair or the angle of their nose to firm conclusions about where their ancestors came from. That's where early interpretations of the Tarim mummies veered hardest off the rails. The logic went something like, these faces look Western to modern observers, therefore these people must be closely related to known Western Eurasian groups. Therefore we can tie them directly to specific populations, Tocharians, Celts, Indo-Europeans on some early migration wave. But appearance is a noisy signal, especially over evolutionary time, and especially in a cemetery full of individuals who are not a single homogeneous group. Traits we intuitively label as European today are distributed across a broad range of West and Central Eurasian populations, and some are simply not strongly diagnostic of ancestry at all. There are convergent patterns, random drift, and the stark reminder that what your eye categorizes is shaped by the faces you grew up seeing. On top of that, mummification changes things. Skin dries and tightens, exaggerating some structures, minimizing others. Hair lightens. Tissue loss can make cheekbones appear sharper, eye sockets deeper, mouths narrower. Take a photograph of a living person, then apply a rigorous, unbiased transformation to simulate 3,000 years of slow dehydration, and the resemblance you end up with might surprise you. None of this means the visual impressions are worthless. They raised valid questions. They helped flag that this population did not fit neatly into the categories local archaeologists expected. But by themselves, they are not answers. They are puzzle pieces that only make sense when you place them alongside textiles, diet, trauma patterns, settlement archaeology, and crucially the genetic and chemical evidence locked inside those same well-preserved tissues. To move beyond first impressions, researchers had to literally cut into the mystery. Shavings of bone, snippets of skin, tiny samples of tooth and hair. The desert had preserved the outer human form so vividly that it was easy to forget the real revolution would come from what couldn't be seen at all. Walk a little way out from any one of those astonishingly preserved bodies, and the context starts to swallow you. Because these people weren't just lying in the sand at random, they were placed in landscapes of meaning that are, in some ways, even stranger than the mummies themselves. Archaeologists like to give names to places that were already ancient long before the first trowel went in. In the Tarim Basin, two of those names come up again and again, Xiaohe and Gumugu. On paper, they're just cemetery numbers in a database. On the ground, they look like something out of an alien ritual. Shower first. Imagine a low, natural sand mound rising from an otherwise flat desert, a kind of dune island in a sea of dust. Around and on top of it, slender wooden posts stand in ranks. Some are tall and phallic, some flat and paddle-shaped, many leaning at different angles as the sand slowly shifts. From a distance, they look like a forest of grave markers, or ship's prows sailing in a frozen wave of sand. Gumugu, not so far away in the same general region, has something similar but not identical. There, rows of wooden poles march across the cemetery, and some graves are covered by plank structures like inverted boats. Skulls and bodies are oriented in consistent directions. The whole layout is deliberate, patterned, emphatically not haphazard. It was these grave fields, more than individual mummies, that forced scholars to re-evaluate what they thought was happening in this desert 4,000 years ago. The wooden markers at Xiaohe are some of the most distinctive features. Many of the graves have one or more tall posts planted at the head. Some are carved into pointy, almost spear-like forms. Others are broader, with a paddle or oar shape. A number are painted in red or black. They aren't just functional markers saying there's a grave here. They're symbolic objects lined up and arranged. Patterns jump out when you chart them burial by burial. Adult males tend to have tall, erect, more clearly phallic posts. Adult females are more often associated with broad, paddle-like boards, sometimes with painted stripes or eye-like designs. At Gumugu, some female graves are covered with wooden planks and have carved sun-radiating discs placed nearby, while male graves have different associated markers. You don't have to be a symbolic genius to suspect some kind of gendered meaning here. Most researchers interpret the posts and boards as male and female symbols, phallus and vulva, boat and womb, upright staff and enclosing shield. None of this can be proved in a strict sense, but the regularity of the patterns makes it very unlikely to be random. Then there's the layout of the graves themselves. At Xiaohe, burials are clustered into distinct phases, layered as the cemetery was used and reused across centuries. Earlier ones are deeper, later ones cut into the older layers. But throughout you see consistent orientations, heads toward a particular cardinal direction, often facing a nearby watercourse that once flowed more reliably than it does today. In some phases men and women are alternated or grouped. In others, small children are placed between adults, almost as if nestling a family unit into the sand. Gumugu's cemetery is divided into separate zones that likely represent chronological or social distinctions. One area holds what look like more elaborate burials, with plank coffins and richer grave goods. Another has simpler interments. Arrangement in rows, spacing, and orientation all hint that whoever organised these cemeteries cared deeply about order, about where exactly each person lay in relation to the others. When you start mapping age and sex across those patterns, a social picture begins to emerge. Not everyone gets the same treatment. Infants and very young children are buried, but in many cases with fewer or simpler grave goods. Adolescents show up, but there's often a threshold somewhere in the teens or early 20s where burial complexity ramps up. Adult men and women dominate the richest graves. Elders, people whose bones show advanced wear, healed injuries, and degenerative changes, are surprisingly well represented, which is itself informative. It means enough people survive to late adulthood in this harsh environment to make old age a recognizable category. At Xiaohe, many adult women are buried in a distinctive way. They're often wrapped in multiple layers of wool cloth, sometimes with extraordinary care, and accompanied by objects clearly linked to fertility and domestic life. Wooden phallic rods placed near the pelvis, small bags containing seeds, combs, and textile tools. Adult men, by contrast, are more likely to be buried with weapons, carved bows, arrows, or symbolic substitutes. The pattern is not absolute, there are exceptions, but it's strong enough to suggest a society where gender roles were sharply defined, or at least symbolically emphasized in death. Women associated with reproduction, household continuity, maybe agricultural or pastoral fertility. Men with defense, hunting, or leadership in external affairs. Age matters too. Some young adults, both male and female, are buried with striking richness. Multiple posts, elaborate textiles, special items positioned carefully around the body. Others of similar age have much simpler graves. That unevenness is one of the first clues that status wasn't just about being an adult man or woman. There were hierarchies here. Some people died important. What marks that importance? The objects placed with them give you the best hints. Graves at Xiaohe and Gumugo are not overflowing with random clutter. Most people are accompanied by a small specific set of things. That selectivity makes each artifact, each choice, carry more weight. Some of the most discussed items are the wooden masks and face covers found in certain burials. These aren't masks in the theatrical sense. They're thin wooden boards, sometimes shaped and painted, placed over the face or near the head. A few have stylized eyes or abstract designs. They may have transformed the identity of the dead, or protected the face, or symbolized a second, spiritual visage. Whatever they meant, not everyone got one. They seem to cluster among particular adults, again hinting at rank or special roles. There are also those unmistakable phallic objects, wooden rods, sometimes painted, sometimes covered in felt, and their counterparts, objects that look very much like stylized vulvas or paddles. These appear especially in female graves placed near the lower abdomen. They could represent fertility, lineage, or the hope for renewal in some kind of afterlife. If you've seen parallels from Bronze Age Europe or the ancient Near East, you're not alone. Archaeologists have noted the cross-cultural similarity of such symbols. But similarity doesn't guarantee shared origin. Humans tend to reinvent sexual symbolism pretty reliably. Other grave goods are more practical but still telling. Leather pouches with herbs or seeds, wooden bowls and cups, pieces of cheese or dairy residue on dishes, likely food for the journey into whatever came next. At Gumugu, some burials have pieces of jade or other stones, rare in the local geology, suggesting access to trade networks or special ritual value. The famous boat-shaped coffins, hollowed logs laid on their sides with the dead placed inside, evoke travel, transition, crossing some cosmic river. Textile fragments in the graves do double duty. They're clothes, yes, but they're also symbols. Some individuals are wrapped in multiple layers of particularly intricate cloth, much finer than the everyday garments we see in other burials. In a world where weaving is labour-intensive and wool is a precious resource, wrapping someone in that much fabric is an emphatic statement. You're essentially sending wealth into the ground. Step back and look at all of this. The posts, the boats, the masks, the fertility symbols, the careful orientations, and the Tarim cemeteries start to look less like isolated oases of weirdness and more like fully developed ritual landscapes. And that is where the debate really took off, because these ritual landscapes didn't appear in a vacuum. For decades, scholars had assumed that sophisticated, symbol-heavy burial customs in this part of Asia must have radiated outward from better-known centres, the great river civilizations of China to the east, or the Bronze Age cultures of Western Inner Asia and beyond. The Tarim was imagined as a recipient, a peripheral zone where ideas and people from elsewhere drifted in and left their mark. Xiaohe and Gumugu complicated that narrative. On the one hand, some features look tantalizingly familiar if you know the broader Bronze Age world. Wooden posts around graves echo practices from steppe cultures further north and west. Boat-shaped coffins and solar motifs have distant cousins in regions stretching from Siberia to Scandinavia. Wool tartans and certain textile techniques align with technologies better documented in Western Eurasia. On the other hand, the specific combination found in the Tarim Basin is unique. No other cemetery has exactly this forest of gendered posts planted in sand mounds, exactly this style of faceboards, exactly this package of dairy offerings and fertility symbols and wooden boats under a desert sky. The patterning of age and sex, the clustering of grave types, the particular way textiles are used, all of it suggests a local tradition with its own logic. So which is it? Are we looking at a cultural system that evolved largely in place, as long-term desert dwellers experimented with how to honour their dead and encode their social values into grave markers? Or are we seeing a mosaic assembled by incoming groups who brought rituals, symbols and technologies from elsewhere, then adapted them to a new environment? Put differently, when you stand amid the posts at Xiaohe, are you in the middle of a homegrown tradition or in the foothills of a migration story? For a long time, scholars tried to answer that question just by comparing objects and layouts. Some argued that the boat coffins and wall patterns must mean influence from far-off Indo-European groups. Others pushed back, pointing to how easy it is for similar solutions to arise independently when people face similar symbolic problems: life, death, fertility, the sun, the journey. But the cemeteries themselves kept raising awkward questions. The strong gender symbolism without direct Chinese or steppe counterparts. The mixed signals in the grave goods, some yes, some no, on external parallels. The way the same burial ground was used for centuries with gradual shifts, not abrupt replacements. At a certain point, staring at wood and cloth wasn't enough. To decide whether these cemeteries were built by cultural insiders slowly elaborating their own rituals, or by newcomers carrying a package of foreign traditions into the desert, researchers needed to move beyond objects. They needed to know who, exactly, these people were at the level of ancestry. Which is why, after mapping every post and cataloguing every mask, the next step was both radical and inevitable, taking those tiny samples of bone and tooth and hair and asking their DNA to weigh in on the debate. If you strip away the drama and just list what was actually found with these people, the Tarim Basin starts to look like a very strange showroom. Cloth, felt, leather, wood, bone, the occasional piece of metal, simple tools, strange ritual items. At first glance, it all seems straightforward. These are the basic materials of Bronze Age life. But archaeologists don't just see a shirt or a knife. They see patterns, techniques, choices. And when they laid all of that out for the Tarim Basin, the pattern raised more questions than it answered. Start with the textiles, because they're some of the most immediately striking things pulled out of that sand. The dry air preserved wool fabric so well that you can still trace individual threads, still see the colours, reds and browns and creams, sometimes in checks and stripes. Some pieces are plain twill, a diagonal weave familiar to anyone who's owned a pair of jeans. Others show more complex patterns. There are fragmentary tartan-like designs, intersecting bands of colour that, to a modern eye, look suspiciously like a Bronze Age plaid. If you've ever seen reconstructions of early European wool garments, you might feel a jolt of recognition. The weave structures and some patterning techniques from the Tarim Basin closely resemble textiles from sites thousands of kilometres away in regions that would later be associated with Indo-European-speaking steppe peoples. That similarity lit up the migration theories. Maybe, the argument went, this wasn't just coincidence. Maybe those Caucasoid faces in the sand really did come from the West, bringing their wool technology and clothing styles with them. The cloth, in this reading, was a kind of fossilised passport, but push closer and the parallels start to fray. Yes, the basic weaving techniques, warp and weft, plain weave and twill, are shared. But by the Bronze Age, those techniques were known across wide swathes of Eurasia. They're efficient ways to turn spun fibre into durable fabric. Any group that keeps sheep and has looms will eventually bump into similar solutions. The dyes tell a similar story. Reds from madder or related plants, browns and yellows from local sources. None of this is exotic. The patterns, while sometimes tartan-like, don't match any one distant tradition closely enough to be called a direct copy. They're more like cousins than twins. Then there's tailoring. Some garments from the Tarim Basin show surprisingly advanced cutting and sewing. Fitted trousers, shaped coats with set-in sleeves, carefully cut pieces joined so that the seams fall in places that maximise movement and warmth. That level of tailoring is rare in the early Bronze Age archaeological record, but not unknown. Again, the temptation is to say, they must have learned this from those people over there. Except, sewing and tailoring sit right at the intersection of necessity and ingenuity. If you ride horses regularly, you eventually invent something like pants. If you live in a cold, windy place, you eventually figure out that fitted clothing insulates better than baggy wraps. The Tarim Basin was both a cold desert and a place where early horse gear shows up. It would be more surprising if they never invented tailored, riding-friendly clothing. So the textiles whisper both ways at once. On one level, they slot neatly into a broad Eurasian Bronze Age toolkit. Wool, twill, simple patterns, some advanced tailoring. On another level, nothing about them screams this came directly from culture X, at time Y, along route Z. They're part of the puzzle, but not the edge piece that locks everything in. Move from soft goods to hard ones, and the picture gets even stranger. Those famous boats used as coffins, hollowed-out logs laid on their sides, with the dead tucked inside, are carved from local wood. They're not seaworthy boats in the literal sense. No one was rowing them across an actual ocean, but they're undeniably boat-shaped, and they're placed in a desert. Add in the upright posts that look like paddles, the way some graves at Gumugo are covered with planks like an inverted hull, and an image begins to form. Crossing, voyage, some kind of imagined river or sea you have to traverse after death. Boat burials show up in multiple places across the Eurasian north, from Siberia to Scandinavia, often with solar or water symbolism attached. Yet here, again, the details don't line up neatly with any one known tradition. The boats are short, coffin-sized, not full-sized boats repurposed for burial. The posts are planted in sand mounds, not by real rivers. The planks that form roof-like structures over some graves are arranged in ways not quite duplicated elsewhere. The wooden masks complicate things further. Thin boards covering faces, sometimes painted, sometimes with simple carved or painted features, eyes, lines, maybe abstract motifs. Wooden face coverings do appear in other ancient cultures, from Egypt to parts of Siberia, but the specific Tarim style is its own thing. The same goes for the stylized phallic rods, vulva-like paddles, and disc objects. You can find broad analogues across the Bronze Age world, but no one-to-one match. All of this makes it hard to say, this wooden ritual package clearly comes from that known group, carried intact across the steppe. It looks more like a local symbolic system built out of some widely shared human themes: journey, sex, sun, protection, expressed in a distinctive visual grammar. When you turn to tools and metals, the clues get sharper in some ways and blurrier in others. By the time these cemeteries were in use, metallurgy was established technology in much of Eurasia. Copper, bronze, occasionally more exotic alloys and objects circulated along long-distance networks. In regions to the north and west of the Tarim, you find rich warrior graves with weapons, ornate metal ornaments, horse gear with bronze fittings. In the Tarim Basin cemeteries, the metal profile is modest. There are metal objects, bronze knives, pins, some small tools and ornaments, but no lavish weapon hoards, no heavy armour, no elaborate metal horse gear with the same density seen on the steppe. You see practical tools for cutting and fastening, simple blade shapes, pin types that can be related broadly to forms known in neighbouring regions, but again, without that tight fingerprint that lets you say, direct copy. Just as important is what's missing. If the Tarim people were recent arrivals from a highly metallurgized culture, you might expect a richer metal toolkit to show up in their graves, more weaponry, more status objects in bronze. Instead, a lot of the everyday work seems to have been done with wood, bone, stone, and a handful of fairly plain metal blades. That doesn't mean they were cut off. Some metal ores exist in the broader region, and trade routes clearly touch the basin at some level. Remember those pieces of jade and the occasional non-local stone. But it does suggest that metal, while known and used, wasn't the central marker of identity or status in these burial grounds. Cloth, wood, and symbolic items carried more weight. So when archaeologists lay all of this out on their metaphorical table, textiles that look a bit like Western fabrics but not exactly, wooden boat coffins that echo distant boat burials but in a desert, ritual objects with global themes but local style, modest metallurgy with some familiar shapes but no full step war kit. They face a basic question. What are we actually seeing here? Shared culture, trade, or independent invention? Those three categories sound neat. In reality, they bleed into each other. Shared culture is what you get when people belong to the same broad tradition. They might be spread across a big region, but they speak related languages, tell overlapping myths, marry each other, and copy each other's styles. You'd expect deep similarities in how they build houses, bury their dead, decorate objects, and organize everyday life. Trade is different. You can be culturally distinct and still swap things. A lump of metal, a piece of glass, a bolt of cloth. An idea for a new tool can travel far beyond the group that invented it. In those cases, you might see foreign-looking objects pop up in a local context, but used in ways that don't quite match their place of origin. Independent invention is when people, facing similar problems, stumble onto similar solutions without any direct connection. You don't need a messenger from across the continent to explain the idea of putting wheels on something heavy or wrapping cloth in diagonal weaves. Given enough time, human groups tend to reinvent certain tricks. So how do archaeologists tell these apart? They start by looking for clusters rather than isolated matches. If a cemetery has just one knife that looks like a type from far away, that smells like trade or imitation. If the entire toolkit, the house plans, the burials, the ornaments, and even the food residues line up closely with a distant culture, that points more towards shared culture or migration. They also pay attention to sequences. Do foreign-looking objects appear suddenly all at once, or do they trickle in over centuries? A sudden package of changes, new house types, new burial rites, new pottery styles appearing all together, can be a sign of incoming people. Slow shifts, where local traditions gradually incorporate a few outside elements, suggest long-term contact without massive population replacement. And they look at how tightly things match. Is it the same metal alloy, the same tool shapes, the same decorative motifs, right down to minor details? Or is it just the general idea, interpreted in a local way? When you apply those tests to the Tarim Basin burial grounds, the results are messy, but instructive. There are definitely signs of connection, textile techniques that fit into a wider Eurasian repertoire, some tool forms that have clear analogues in neighbouring regions, jade and other stones that likely arrived through exchange, even certain patterns of animal husbandry and diet that tie in, loosely, with broader steppe and Central Asian practices. At the same time, the total package, the combination of funerary architecture, ritual items, gendered symbolism, textile use, and metal profile, doesn't map cleanly onto any known outside culture. There's no single place you can point to on a map and say, this is clearly Tarim Basin in exile, which brings you to a crucial caution. Looks similar is not the same as these people migrated from there. It's very tempting, especially when you see a tartan-like cloth or a boat-shaped coffin, to jump straight to a migration story. Humans love neat narratives. They came from here, they moved there, they brought this with them. But in archaeology, superficial resemblance is the starting point of an argument, not the conclusion. To claim migration, you need converging lines of evidence, multiple independent indicators all pointing the same way: objects, architecture, diet, isotopes, and, now that we can access it, DNA. Without that convergence, you're often left with what the Tarim Basin presents so clearly: a mosaic of hints, suggestive similarities, and equally suggestive differences. The artifacts from Xiaohe, Gumugo, and related sites tell you that these people were plugged into at least some of the technological and symbolic currents of Bronze Age Eurasia. They weren't an isolated bubble of innovation sealed off from everyone else, but they also tell you that, by the time those mummies were laid in the sand, their community had forged a distinct way of being, and a distinct way of dying. And that's where the puzzle sharpened into a paradox. If the objects could be read both as local and as faintly connected, and if style alone couldn't settle whether these were long-term desert dwellers or relatively recent arrivals, there was only one place left to look for a decisive clue: inside the bodies themselves. To find out where their ideas came from, researchers would have to start by asking where they, as biological populations, came from. When archaeologists first started pulling those bodies out of the Tarim sands, they weren't operating in a vacuum. They already knew something about this region from a much later period, and that knowledge quietly pulled on their expectations like gravity. Fast forward from the Bronze Age mummies to about 2,000 years ago. By then, the Tarim Basin is no longer just a harsh inland desert. It's a strategic crossroads. Chinese chronicles talk about the Western regions, oases with kings, caravans, conflicts and tribute. Indian Buddhist pilgrims pass through. Iranian-speaking merchants move goods and stories along dusty tracks. Later, Turkic and then Islamic powers reshape the map again. In other words, by the time history starts writing things down in this part of the world, Xinjiang is already a palimpsest. Layer upon layer of peoples and languages, each one partly erasing and partly preserving what came before. That's where the trouble begins, because if your first detailed written sources for a place are from, say, 200 BCE to 900 CE, and your graves with well-preserved people are from 1800 to 1000 BCE, it's very tempting to draw a line straight between them, to assume continuity, to assume that the weirdly Western-looking mummies must be the ancestors of some later group whose language we can actually read. And in the Tarim Basin, there is one set of later voices that seemed, for a while, like the perfect fit. They belong to people we call somewhat anachronistically the Tocharians. The name itself is a scholarly accident. Ancient Greek and Roman authors mention a group called Tocharioi, somewhere around Bactria, far to the west. 19th century scholars, flush with new discoveries and not overly cautious, stuck that label onto a completely different language group found in the Tarim Basin because, well, the name sounded vaguely similar and everything in Central Asia kind of blurred together in their mental maps. The people who actually wrote these languages never called themselves Tocharians, but the label stuck, so we're kind of stuck with it too. What matters isn't the name, it's the languages. Early in the 20th century, explorers and archaeologists began to stumble on forgotten Buddhist monasteries and ruined towns buried along the edges of the Taklamakan. Places like Kucha, Turfan, and Karashar. In collapsed stupas and sand-filled rooms, they found manuscripts, palm leaf books, paper scrolls, wall inscriptions. Many were in languages they recognized: Sanskrit, Chinese, various Iranian tongues. But some weren't. There were texts written in a script adapted from Indian Brahmi, but the sounds didn't match Sanskrit or any known Prakrit. When linguists tried to decode them, something astonishing happened. The grammar, the word endings, the way verbs changed with person and number, all of it looked distinctly Indo-European. Not just in a vague, oh, this feels familiar way, in a precise structural way. Even more shocking, these unknown languages seemed closer to very old branches of Indo-European like Latin, Greek, and especially the Anatolian languages than to Iranian or Indo-Aryan. They preserved certain archaisms, like ancient vowel patterns and case endings, that had dropped out in almost all other surviving Indo-European tongues. It was as if some lost cousin of Latin and Greek had been quietly hanging out in the deserts of northwest China until the first millennium CE, writing Buddhist texts and administrative notes, then vanished, leaving only a few hundred fragmentary pages. Scholars eventually realized there were at least two closely related languages here, now called Tocharian A and Tocharian B. A third, very fragmentary variety is sometimes dubbed Tocharian C. Tocharian B appears in a wider range of secular and religious documents and likely reflects the everyday speech of people in places like Kucha. Tocharian A seems more liturgical and monastery-based, possibly an already high or ritual language by the time we see it. Both were written between roughly the 5th and 9th centuries CE, at a time when Buddhism and trade were humming along the Silk Road. And here's the key. Tocharian is not just Indo-European. It's weirdly, unexpectedly central in the Indo-European family tree, like someone dug up a missing chapter in a book we thought we'd already outlined. So now put yourself in the shoes of an archaeologist in the 1980s or 1990s, staring at Bronze Age mummies from the same broad region, noticing textiles and physical features that look vaguely Western, and knowing that, 1,000+ years later, this desert hosted Indo-European-speaking Buddhists. It's almost irresistible to connect the dots. Maybe people suggested these mummies are the proto-Tocharians. Maybe the same population that buried their dead in boat coffins, around 1800 BCE eventually, after a millennium or two of change, shows up in the historical record as Tocharian-speaking oasis dwellers, who build monasteries and copy Buddhist sutras. It's a neat story, too neat. Because when you zoom in on the timelines and context, the cracks show immediately. Those boat burial cemeteries like Xiaohe and Gumugo sit in the early to mid-2nd millennium BCE. That's roughly the age of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, the tail end of the Shang in China. The world of bronze and chariots, long before classical Greece or the Roman Republic. The Tocharian manuscripts, by contrast, come from a world of paper, Buddhist monastic networks, and already established Silk Road traffic. Their scribes live in walled towns with irrigation agriculture, convert to an Indian religion, correspond with Chinese officials, and occasionally use Iranian loanwords alongside native Indo-European vocabulary. We are talking about a gap of more than 1,000 years, maybe 1,500, between the last burials in some of those desert cemeteries and the first Tocharian texts we can date securely. In that gap, an enormous amount can happen. Migrations, language shifts, population turnovers, plague, climate change, empire building and empire collapse. So while it is entirely possible that there is some sort of genealogical thread connecting the early Bronze Age desert dwellers and the later Tocharian-speaking townsfolk, you can't just assume it, you have to demonstrate it, and language alone won't do that for you. This is where a basic but often misunderstood principle comes in. Languages can move without people moving very much, and people can move without their languages sticking. Think about Latin. The Latin language spread across Western Europe with the Roman Empire. But in many places the genetic impact of actual Italians settling in large numbers appears modest. Local populations adopted Latin because it became the prestige language of administration, law and urban life. Centuries later, as the empire crumbled, those Latin dialects morphed into French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian. Now flip the scenario. Consider the incursions of steppe nomads into Eastern Europe in various periods. Archaeology and genetics both show real demographic movement. But in some regions, these groups were absorbed by larger local populations and lost their languages within a few generations, leaving only subtle traces in vocabulary or personal names. Language spread is opportunistic. An elite can impose its speech on a majority. A religious tradition can carry a liturgical language far from its original homeland. Trade networks can incentivize bilingualism until one language outcompetes the others. None of this requires a clean one-to-one mapping between genes and grammar. So when you stand in the Tarim Basin, looking from Bronze Age graves to medieval manuscripts, you have to hold two thoughts at once. First, it is absolutely plausible that Indo-European languages, including whatever ancestral form eventually became Tocharian, reached this region through some combination of migration and cultural spread in the late Bronze or early Iron Age. The geographic and linguistic patterns across Central Asia make that a reasonable hypothesis. Second, none of that tells you by itself who those much older mummified individuals were, biologically or linguistically. They could be ancestors of later Indo-European speakers. They could be from a different, earlier population that was partly replaced or linguistically assimilated long before anyone wrote anything down. They could represent a complex mixture of groups. The historical record from the last 2,000 years in Xinjiang makes things more, not less, complicated. Chinese sources describe the peoples of the western regions, using ethnonyms that don't line up neatly with our later labels. Iranian-speaking Saka and Sogdians appear in some oasis kingdoms. Turkic-speaking groups show up later, reshaping linguistic landscapes again. Islamic conquest layers new religious and cultural norms onto still evolving populations. By the time you reach the present, the region's genetic and cultural makeup is the product of repeated waves of movement and mixing. Trying to read that backwards onto Bronze Age graves is like trying to reconstruct an original sentence after it's been copied, edited, translated, and overwritten for centuries. That's why, as soon as those Tocharian manuscripts entered the conversation, careful researchers started raising their hands and saying, "Slow down." Finding Indo-European languages in first millennium CE oases tells you about that period. It doesn't automatically license you to back-project them 2,000 years earlier onto every human body that ever lay under Tarim sands. To test any specific connection, these mummies are ancestral to these later language communities. You need chronology, who was where, when, and you need biology, who was actually related to whom. That means you can't just rely on typological resemblances, similar clothing, similar burial forms, similar looking faces in reconstructed portraits. You have to anchor your story in direct evidence, radiocarbon dates that tell you the actual age of each burial, and genetic data that let you compare those ancient individuals to later and neighbouring populations. If language can leap between groups with minimal gene flow, and genes can migrate without carrying language with them, then neither one by itself will give you the full story. You need to triangulate. For the Tarim mummies, that realization changed the research agenda. Instead of asking, do they look like proto-Tocharians? The more pointed question became, when exactly were these people buried, and what does their DNA say about their place in the wider human family? Were they closely related to known steppe herders to the north and west, as some of the textile and physical traits seem to imply? Were they more like early farmers from the east? Or did they represent something stranger, a lineage that didn't match any of the usual suspects on our maps of prehistoric Eurasia? To answer that, archaeologists and geneticists would have to do something invasive, something that earlier generations of researchers either couldn't or wouldn't do: take samples directly from the mummies themselves and pull time and ancestry out of their bones and teeth. The historical shadows of the Silk Road, the Tocharian texts, the Chinese chronicles, the later waves of Iranian and Turkic speakers had framed the questions, but the answers were going to come from much older, much quieter witnesses lying in wooden coffins beneath layers of desert sand. If you've ever done one of those mail-in ancestry kits, you already have a mental model for how this works. Spit in a tube, mail it off, wait a few weeks, and out comes a colourful pie chart that claims to summarise hundreds of years of your family history. Ancient DNA is like that, except everything is harder, slower, and far more fragile, and the stakes aren't, did my great-grandfather lie about being part Viking? They're, are we about to rewrite entire chapters of human prehistory? Let's start with something basic that often gets blurred in popular accounts: what ancient DNA actually is. Geneticists typically use that phrase for DNA older than a few hundred years, often thousands, sometimes tens of thousands. By that point, your genome is no longer a neat, tidy double helix, waiting patiently in a cheek cell. It's been baked, soaked, oxidized, snapped into fragments, and chewed on by microbes for centuries. Imagine taking a long, perfectly written novel and feeding it into a paper shredder every day for 3,000 years. By the time a scientist opens the burial, they're not holding a book, they're holding a dusting of confetti. Some of that confetti is human. A lot of it is bacteria, fungi, and environmental DNA from the soil. A tiny fraction of the total genetic material in a sample might be what you actually care about. And hovering over everything, like a constant invisible threat, is contamination. Modern human DNA is everywhere. On gloves, in lab air, in the breath of the technician who leans a little too close, on the brush a worker used in the 1970s to clean sand off a mummy's face before anyone ever worried about genetics. To a sequencing machine, your skin cell from yesterday and a Bronze Age cell from 4,000 years ago are just DNA. It doesn't know which one's more interesting. If you're not incredibly careful, your own genome will drown out the ancient signal you're trying to detect. That's why, when researchers decided to sample the Tarim mummies, the actual process looked much less like Indiana Jones and much more like a cross between surgery and a crime lab. There's another wrinkle. You can't just take any random piece of a skeleton and expect miracles. Some tissues preserve DNA better than others, and over the last couple of decades, ancient DNA specialists have gotten picky, almost strategic, about where they drill. Teeth are a classic choice. The hard enamel on the outside and dense dentin underneath act like armour, shielding DNA locked in the pulp cavity from water, microbes and chemical damage. If you drill into the root of a molar and powder the interior, you often get a decent amount of genetic material, especially in relatively young ancient samples. Another favourite is the petrous part of the temporal bone, the rock-hard bit of skull near your inner ear. This thing is dense. It's one of the toughest bones in the body, and for reasons that are still being studied, it tends to hang on to DNA extraordinarily well. In some Neolithic skeletons, petrous bone has yielded orders of magnitude more endogenous DNA, the individual's own genetic material, than other parts of the same skull. Of course, drilling into a petrous bone is destructive. You're literally grinding part of a skull into powder. For unique or culturally sensitive remains, that's not a trivial decision. Archaeologists and descendant communities have to weigh scientific value against damage to a finite and often sacred resource. Then there's hair. Hair can be a genetic goldmine, but it comes with quirks. The Tarim mummies have well-preserved hair in many cases, braided, cut, dyed, even partially shaved in distinctive patterns. Hair shafts usually don't have a full complement of nuclear DNA, but they can preserve mitochondrial DNA fairly well. Under exceptional conditions, you might even tease out fragments of nuclear DNA. Each tissue type, teeth, petrous bone, hair, offers a different balance of yield, preservation, and cultural acceptability. Researchers have to choose carefully, case by case. Do you drill a tooth and risk damaging a face that's become iconic? Do you take petrous bone from a skull that might be central to future morphological studies? Do you cut a lock of hair that's been perfectly intact for 4,000 years? Every sample is a trade-off, but even once you have your precious powder or hair clippings, DNA alone doesn't tell you when this person lived. For that, you need timekeeping from a different line of evidence. That's where radiocarbon dating comes in. Radiocarbon is basically a clock built into organic matter. While you're alive, you constantly take in carbon, including a tiny amount of radioactive carbon-14 created in the atmosphere. When you die, that intake stops, and the carbon-14 in your tissues starts to decay at a known rate. Measure how much carbon-14 is left in a piece of bone collagen, or a scrap of textile, compare it to the atmospheric baseline, and you can estimate how long it's been since that material stopped exchanging carbon with the environment. It's not perfect. There are calibration curves, local reservoir effects, and error ranges. Your date might be around 1900 to 1700 BCE rather than 3:17 PM on a Tuesday. But radiocarbon is still our most direct, widely applicable way of putting an absolute age on organic remains in the last 50,000 years or so. Geneticists sometimes talk about genetic dating or molecular clocks, but it's crucial to understand what those can and can't do. On a broad scale, you can look at how many mutations separate two lineages and, assuming an average mutation rate, estimate when they had a common ancestor. That's how researchers infer, for example, that certain population splits happened in the late Ice Age rather than yesterday. But those are averages over thousands or tens of thousands of years. They're fuzzy, model-dependent, and much less precise than a good radiocarbon date on a specific bone. You wouldn't use genetic dating alone to decide whether a burial is 800 versus 1200 BCE if you can possibly get radiocarbon from the same individual. In the Tarim case, radiocarbon told researchers these mummies belong firmly in the early to middle 2nd millennium BCE. Whatever their DNA says, it has to be interpreted against that chronological backdrop. They cannot be directly sampled representatives of a 1st millennium CE Tocharian monastery. They lived more than 1,000 years earlier. So what happens once you've got both? A time anchor from radiocarbon and a shaky but recoverable genome from an ancient tooth or bone. You have to ask a deceptively simple question. Who are they most similar to? This is where ancestry inference comes in, and also where headlines tend to go off the rails. When you send your spit to a consumer company, they compare your DNA to a reference panel. Large datasets of genotypes from people whose grandparents, great-grandparents, or documented family history tie them to particular regions. Ancient DNA works on the same principle, but the reference panels include ancient individuals as well as modern ones. You're not just asking, do these mummies look more like present-day Europeans or East Asians? You're asking, how do they plot relative to Bronze Age steppe herders, early farmers from the Yellow River, Neolithic groups from Iran, modern Siberian populations, and so on? A common tool here is PCA, Principal Component Analysis. Think of PCA as a way of compressing genetic variation into a couple of axes that capture the biggest differences between groups. If you plotted thousands of modern Eurasian genomes, you'd get a kind of cloud of points, with clusters stretching from Europe to East Asia, from the Arctic to South Asia. Now you take your Tarim individual and drop their genome into that coordinate system. Where does the point land? If it falls smack in the middle of modern northern Chinese variation, that tells you one story. If it sits among Bronze Age steppe herders, that suggests another. If it shows up in some weird corner of the plot, distant from almost everyone, you might be looking at a lineage that doesn't have close surviving relatives in your reference set. But PCA is just a projection. It doesn't, by itself, tell you why a point lands where it does. That's where explicit models come in, statistical tools with names like admixture, QPADM, or F-statistics. These methods basically ask questions like, can we model this ancient individual as a mixture of X% from population A and Y% from population B? Do we need a third source? Does this genome share more alleles with group C than with group D after controlling for others? Under the hood, they rely on assumptions. Assumptions about how populations split, how much they mixed, which reference samples actually represent distinct ancestral components, rather than already admixed groups themselves. If your reference panel is missing key ancient populations, your model can be forced to approximate. It might say 20% from Group A, 80% from Group B, when in reality it's mostly from some unsampled Group C that happens to be genetically intermediate between A and B. So when you see a news article proclaiming, scientists find that ancient X were exactly 40% this and 60% that, there's a lot of cautious footnote hiding underneath. And when you see something even more dramatic, like, this mummy's DNA matches no known population, that too is a simplification. Usually what it means is not that their DNA is alien or fundamentally different from all other humans. It means that within the set of ancient and modern genomes currently sampled, there is no close, unadmixed twin. The individual might sit on a branch that split off early from groups we do know, or represent a mixture of ancestries that, in that exact proportion, isn't present in any comparison population. In other words, no known population really means no known population in our current still incomplete reference library. For the Tarim mummies, researchers had to thread all these needles at once. They had fragile, heavily degraded DNA crowding up against contamination risks. They had to choose where to sample on bodies that, in some cases, had become symbols in public debates. They had radiocarbon dates fixing the mummies firmly in the Bronze Age, long before our first written glimpses of Tocharian speakers, and they had to drop these ancient genomes into a statistical landscape shaped by what samples we happen, so far, to have from Greater Eurasia. Out of that process, patterns emerged, odd enough that even the cautious scientists were surprised, but those patterns only make sense once you understand how much work and how much uncertainty goes into each neat colour block on a genetic bar chart. The next step was to translate those cautious, probabilistic signals into a story about real people, where their ancestors might have come from, who they were related to, and why they don't sit neatly on any of the familiar branches of the Eurasian family tree. That story began to crystallize when the first full genetic results from the Tarim mummies were finally published, and they didn't match anyone's expectations. When the first real wave of genetic papers on the Tarim mummies started to come out, a lot of people approached them with a quiet confidence. The archaeological story seemed, if not simple, at least bounded. You had the steppe to the north and west, already known by then to be full of Bronze Age herders with a characteristic genetic profile. You had early farmers and pastoralists spreading through what's now northern China. You had various Siberian groups to the northeast. The Tarim Basin sat at the intersection of all that. So the mental checklist was straightforward. Are these people mostly steppe, mostly East Asian, some kind of reasonable mix of the two? The earliest genetic work didn't have the luxury of whole genomes. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the tools were cruder. Researchers were mostly targeting mitochondrial DNA, the little circular genome in your cell's energy factories that you inherit from your mother, and Y chromosome markers that pass down the paternal line. Those early studies sampled tiny numbers of individuals, a handful of teeth, a few fragments of bone. Some were Tarim mummies proper. Others came from neighbouring regions or later time periods in Xinjiang and the surrounding mountains. What they saw looked, at first glance, like it fit familiar narratives. On the Y chromosome side, some mummies carried lineages that were common in Western Eurasia, types that, in modern populations, you find at high frequencies in parts of Europe and Western Siberia. That seemed to scream Western steppe influence, maybe even a direct link to those tall herders archaeologists were already tracing from the Pontic-Caspian steppe out towards Central Asia. On the mitochondrial side, there was more variety. Some haplogroups, those alphabet soup labels like H, K, T, C, that geneticists use for mitochondrial lineages, were clearly Western-leaning. Others looked more like types you see in modern East Asian or Siberian populations. If you squinted, you could turn this into a satisfyingly tidy picture. Maybe male-biased migration from the West, intermarrying with more Eastern maternal lines, steppe men, local women, cultural blending on the desert oases. It made sense. It aligned with certain archaeological interpretations of pottery styles, textiles, and burial customs. It fit long-standing ideas about Indo-European speakers moving east, possibly bringing Tocharian languages with them. It gave everyone a familiar cast of characters. But there were cracks, even in those first papers. For one thing, the sample sizes were microscopic. 2 Y chromosomes here, 4 there. A dozen mitochondrial genomes, some of them incomplete. In statistical terms, that's like trying to infer the dietary habits of an entire city, because you watch 3 people order lunch. Humans are variable. In any population, even a fairly homogeneous one, you'll find multiple Y chromosome lineages and multiple mitochondrial haplogroups. Chance alone can make a tiny sample look more Western, or more Eastern, than the broader group actually was. Imagine walking into a random classroom and asking 3 students where their mothers were born. If those 3 all happen to have immigrant mothers from the same country, you might wrongly conclude that this is a school primarily serving that nationality. With 10 classrooms, the illusion fades. With the entire school, it disappears. Those early Tarim and Xinjiang studies were operating at the 1 classroom 3 kids level. On top of that, ancient DNA labs back then were still refining their contamination controls. Some of the earliest work on Eurasian mummies has since been re-evaluated because modern DNA quietly snuck into the datasets. Even a few contaminant molecules can make a big difference when your total ancient signal is already faint. Different labs also use different sequencing targets, different amplification methods, and different criteria for declaring a sequence authentic. One group might throw out any fragment that didn't show typical ancient damage patterns. Another might keep more borderline reads. When you're dealing with short stretches of mitochondrial DNA rather than entire genomes, those choices matter. So by the mid-2000s and early 2010s, you had a patchwork of results. Some papers emphasized European-like paternal lineages and framed the mummies as essentially out-of-place Westerners. Others stressed the presence of East Asian or Siberian-like maternal lineages and leaned into a mixed frontier zone population story. Still others, sampling slightly different sites or slightly later burials, found patterns that didn't quite match either of those neat narratives. It's not that anyone was fabricating data. They were just peering through different, very small keyholes into a complex past, then extrapolating beyond what those tiny keyholes could really support. Meanwhile, the methods were racing ahead. By the late 2010s, sequencing entire genomes from ancient individuals had become feasible on a routine basis for well-preserved remains. Instead of a handful of markers on mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, researchers could survey hundreds of thousands, even millions, of positions across the nuclear genome, the main genetic archive you inherit from both parents. That shift is like going from one grainy black and white photograph to a high-resolution video with sound. All sorts of patterns become visible that were previously invisible or ambiguous. When the first group set out to do this kind of whole genome work on Tarim Basin mummies, they did it with all the lessons of the previous 20 years in mind. Larger sample sets, more rigorous contamination testing, strict damage authentication, radiocarbon dates pinned to specific individuals rather than borrowed from nearby artifacts, and, crucially, much richer reference datasets to compare against, not just a handful of modern populations, but hundreds of ancient genomes spanning the steppe, the Altai, Siberia, the Iranian plateau, the Indus region, and early Chinese civilizations. They also brought sharper tools for asking subtle questions. Instead of simply aligning haplogroups to modern populations, they could run allele-sharing statistics, test dozens of mixture models, and formally reject scenarios that looked attractive but didn't fit the actual math. You might think that with all that extra power, the story would cleanly converge on one of the early intuitive hypotheses. Yes, they were basically Western steppe herders planted in the middle of China's desert. Or, yes, they were a straightforward blend of local East Asians and incoming Indo-Europeans. But when the full genomes came back, something else emerged. When you dropped the early Tarim individuals onto those PCA plots, those compressed genetic maps of Eurasian variation, they didn't land neatly with the Western steppe herders. They didn't fall into the cluster of Bronze Age populations from northern China. They didn't sit halfway between those two, as a simple mix. They sat off to the side. Statistically, they were human, obviously. They shared the same broad sweep of ancestry as other ancient Eurasians. But in more detailed models, they didn't match closely with any single known population, ancient or modern. Nor could they be convincingly modelled as a two-way mix of any pair of known groups. This is where that phrase from news headlines, matches no known population, starts to crop up, and it's where you have to be very careful about what that actually means. On paper, when geneticists say, no close match, they're making a specific technical point. It doesn't mean these mummies are fundamentally unlike other humans. It means, given the reference panel we currently have, there is no population that sits in the same spot in genetic space, with the same patterns of allele frequencies, without invoking extra ancestral components. In other words, if you try to explain the Tarim genomes as, say, 60% from this steppe group and 40% from that early Chinese farmer group, the model flunks. The statistics say, no, you're missing something. There's extra shared drift here with some other lineage you haven't accounted for. That some other lineage might be a population we've already sampled, but in a form that's been heavily admixed, and therefore isn't a clean analogue. Or it might be a population we haven't sampled at all yet, a ghost in the data, inferred from its effects on others. And this is where databases and sampling bias quietly shape our stories. Most ancient DNA work has so far concentrated on certain regions: Europe, parts of Western Siberia, pieces of the Near East, some corridors into Central Asia and northern China. Vast stretches of Inner Asia, the Tibetan Plateau, the deeper Tarim hinterlands, and many parts of Western China remain only spottily sampled, if at all. So when you compare the Tarim mummies to all known populations, you're really saying all populations for which we currently have reasonably good genomes. That library is impressive compared to where we were 20 years ago, but it's still far from complete. The first whole genome Tarim study leaned into this caution. The authors didn't just say, no match. They spelled out the limitations. Their models showed that the Tarim people carried a surprisingly unmixed component of ancestry that looked most similar to very ancient North Eurasian lineages that had, by the Bronze Age, largely disappeared as distinct populations elsewhere. That was a shock. The expectation had been some kind of frontier melting pot. Steppe herders streaming in, local foragers or farmers absorbing them, lots of mixing at a crossroads. Instead, the genomic signal suggested something more like an isolated pocket of a very old lineage, persisting in the Tarim Basin long after it had been largely swamped or blended away in neighbouring regions. Not everyone was ready to accept that immediately. Other teams, working with overlapping but not identical samples, probed the data with slightly different models. Some argued for more step-related input, pointing to faint signals of shared alleles with known herder groups. Others emphasised hints of connections to early East Asian farmers. Debates flared in the technical literature. How much of that ancient component was real, and how much might be a modelling artefact driven by missing references. But even amid those disagreements, a few things were becoming clear. First, the earlier simple narratives that leaned heavily on a handful of Y chromosomes or mitochondrial lineages were, at best, incomplete. Second, the Tarim genomes were not comfortably sitting inside any well-characterised Bronze Age cluster. And third, whatever was going on in this desert basin genetically wasn't just a straightforward replay of the steppe meets China story happening in other parts of Inner Asia. Those first whole genome results forced a pause. If these people weren't just Westerners who had marched in, and they weren't simply local East Asians with a bit of steppe flavour, then who were they, in deeper time? To answer that, researchers had to look beyond the familiar Eurasian actors and consider lineages that, for most of us, only exist as statistical shadows, ancestral populations with no obvious living representatives, inferred from their imprint on others. One of those shadows, an ancient ghost population from the far north of Eurasia, turned out to be a surprisingly good starting point for understanding the Tarim mummies' genetic strangeness. And that's where the story goes next. To meet this ghost population, you have to go back much further than the Bronze Age, back past the time of the Tarim mummies, past the rise of the first cities in Mesopotamia, past the earliest farmers planting wheat in the Fertile Crescent. You're in the late Ice Age now. Most of northern Eurasia is cold, dry steppe and tundra. Glaciers grind across what is now Scandinavia and Canada. Huge swathes of Siberia and Central Asia are habitable, but harsh. This is a world of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, of scattered bands of hunter-gatherers whose names we will never know. From this deep, frozen backdrop, geneticists have pulled a handful of remarkably well-preserved skeletons. A child buried near Lake Baikal, another young boy interred at a site called Malta, not far from Lake Baikal either. A few more individuals from later, scattered sites in Siberia. Their bones are old, about 20 to 25,000 years old, and their DNA is some of the earliest high-quality genetic material we have from northern Eurasia. When those genomes were first sequenced, they didn't fall neatly with any modern group. In a sense, they did for Ice Age Eurasia what the Tarim mummies later did for the Bronze Age. They sat off to the side. They weren't East Asians. They weren't Europeans. They weren't simply halfway between those either. Instead, they seemed to share deep ancestry with many later populations across a huge swath of the map, with some early West Eurasians, with some Siberian groups, even with the ancestors of Native Americans. Geneticists gave this ancestral component a label, Ancient North Eurasians, often shortened to ANE. It's not the name of a specific tribal culture. It's a statistical shorthand. When you look at the genomes of many later peoples and try to explain their ancestry, you find you need to invoke something like this ANE component, a ghost lineage that once lived in northern Eurasia and contributed to multiple later populations, but that, as a separate unmixed group, doesn't exist anymore. This is what ghost population means in genetics. Not spirits, not conspiracies, just a population that you can infer from its footprints in others, even if you've only captured its genome directly a few times, or not at all. Now circle back to the Tarim Basin. When researchers started modelling the Tarim mummies' genomes, they tried all the usual suspects first. Could these people be a mixture of Western steppe herders and something like ancient northern Chinese farmers? Could they be a blend of Siberian foragers and early Iranian-related farmers? Could any combination of known Bronze Age groups recreate that odd position they occupied on genetic maps? Those models kept failing. Over and over, the stats signalled, something's missing. So the team widened the search. They started reaching further back in time, plugging in older, more ancestral components, instead of just Bronze Age populations. Among those deeper lineages were the ancient North Eurasians. Here the math did something interesting. If you treat the Tarim people, not as a mix of Bronze Age groups, but as overwhelmingly descended from an ANE-like lineage, the model suddenly fit much better. You still need to allow for a tiny amount of other ancestry, whispers of contact with neighbouring populations, but the bulk of their genetic makeup lines up most closely with this old, Ice Age ghost from the far north. Not identically. No ancient population has stayed frozen in time for 10 or 15,000 years. There's drift, the slow, random shifting of gene frequencies as small groups split, shrink, and expand. The Tarim genomes are like a cousin branch that split from the known ANE individuals long ago and then went its own way. But in relative terms, that's where they sit, as a deeply ancient North Eurasian-derived population that, by the early 2nd millennium BCE, was still surprisingly unmixed compared to most of their neighbours. This is how a population can be unmatched today, and yet entirely real in the past. Think of human genetic history as a series of rivers joining and diverging. At any given moment, you have many small streams of ancestry flowing across a landscape. Over thousands of years, some merge into larger rivers, others dry up. Some plunge underground and only reappear far downstream. The ancient North Eurasians are like one of those old headwaters streams. We glimpse them clearly at a few Ice Age sites. Later, their water flows into a lot of bigger rivers, into the ancestors of Native Americans, into some West Eurasian steppe groups, into certain Siberian hunter-gatherers. But the original, unmixed stream mostly disappears from the surface. The Tarim mummies look like a pocket where part of that ANE-like stream stayed at the surface, somewhat shielded from the major confluences that reshaped much of Eurasia during the Holocene. In other words, they're not aliens, and they're not laboratory inventions. They're a remnant. This is an important distinction to make, because the phrase no known population tends to feed wilder interpretations. Unmatched in the technical sense doesn't mean biologically bizarre. The Tarim mummies share the same fundamental genetic architecture as other humans. They have the same kinds of genes for immune function, metabolism, hair and eye pigmentation, lactose digestion. Nothing in their DNA falls outside the ordinary human range. What's unusual is the combination and the relative lack of later overlays. By the time they were living and dying in the Tarim oases, most populations elsewhere in Eurasia had already gone through multiple waves of mixture. Early farmers mixing with local foragers, steppe pastoralists mixing with both, later movements of people layering on top. Those events tend to blur old distinctions. Imagine taking a dozen distinct paint colours and mixing them over and over. After a while, everything starts to look like different shades of brown and grey. But every now and then, in some forgotten corner, you find a patch where a particular original colour is still vivid. Not untouched, but far less diluted. The Tarim genomes are like that vivid patch, heavily ANE-like, with only light streaks of other paints running through them. Genetic isolation, in this sense, is about probabilities and contact, not about being cut off from humanity. It doesn't mean no one ever walked in or out of the Tarim Basin. It means that, generation after generation, the amount of sustained gene flow from major surrounding populations was low enough that this ancient ancestry stayed dominant. That's a hard idea to hold together with the mental image of the Tarim as a crossroads, a key node on what later became the Silk Road. We're used to thinking of crossroads as places of mixture, but timing matters. In the early Bronze Age, before the great caravan routes had really formed, the Tarim Basin could be both connected in terms of trade and ideas, yet relatively insulated in terms of marriage networks. Caravans can move goods over long distances without necessarily producing large-scale mixing of people. A few traders stop for a season. They sell lapis or jade or wool. They pick up grain or dried fruit. Then they move on. The genetic impact of a passing merchant is small compared to the impact of entire clans resettling with their herds. The genomic data suggests that for quite a while, those deeper resettlement events were limited. The Tarim inhabitants maintained a mostly local gene pool, rooted in this ancient northern lineage, even as they interacted culturally with neighbours who had very different genetic histories. And this is where genetics loops back to archaeology. If the Tarim people were not, for the most part, recent migrants from the steppe, then the steppe-like elements in their material culture, certain types of felt hats, particular wagon designs, specific burial features, take on a different meaning. Instead of being straightforward evidence that steppe herders moved in and brought their genes, those traits could signal cultural borrowing, imitation, or gradual diffusion of ideas along contact networks. A mostly local gene pool implies that a lot of the distinctive traits we see in Tarim cemeteries emerge from within that community, shaped by their own history, their own environment, and selective adoption of outside influences. The elaborate boat-shaped coffins, the felt hats, the plant offerings, the way bodies are wrapped and positioned. These may be less about an intrusive people imposing their customs, and more about an ancient desert society integrating pieces of a wider Bronze Age world into an older local tradition. It also forces us to rethink where innovation happens. We tend to assume that new technologies and social forms radiate from a few centers of civilization out to marginal edges, but a genetically distinctive, long-standing population sitting in a challenging, resource-scarce environment like the Tarim Basin has every incentive to experiment, with irrigation, with animal management, with textile production, with ways of organizing small communities around fragile water sources. The fact that their genes track back to a ghostly Ice Age lineage doesn't make them static or primitive. It just means that their particular branch of humanity took a different demographic path than their neighbours. One more wrinkle. If the Tarim population is heavily ANE-like, that suggests that the story of ancient North Eurasian ancestry didn't end in the Ice Age or vanish quietly into the genomes of later steppe groups. At least one offshoot of that lineage migrated southward or west-southwest at some point, found its way into the desert fringe around the Tarim, and persisted there for millennia. We don't yet know what that journey looked like. We don't know whether there were intermediate populations along now dry rivers, or in mountain valleys that haven't yet yielded ancient DNA. We don't know exactly when that ANE-derived group first arrived in the basin, or how their presence interacted with any earlier inhabitants we haven't sampled yet. Those are gaps that only more bones, more genomes, and more careful excavation can fill. But the outlines are there. A ghost lineage, long thought to be mostly absorbed into other peoples, shows up in force in a Bronze Age desert community. That community is not a transplanted chunk of the North Eurasian steppe, and not a simple hybrid of neighbouring farmers and herders. It's its own thing. Old, local in a deep sense, yet plugged into the cultural currents around it. That realization changes the questions we ask next. If the Tarim mummies are, genetically speaking, the descendants of a stubbornly persistent ancient lineage, what does that mean for their relationships with their neighbours? How much mixing happened at the edges of their world? And how do we reconcile a mostly local gene pool with the clear signs of contact and exchange we see in their artefacts and in the written records of later periods? To answer that, we have to shift perspective from the ghost population inside the basin to the moving, mixing peoples around it, the steppe herders, the early farmers, the mountain folk in the surrounding ranges, and trace where, when, and how their genes did or didn't seep into this desert enclave. Step outside the Tarim Basin for a moment. You're standing on a low ridge in what is now the Tocharian Basin, north of the Tian Shan Mountains. It's not a wall-to-wall desert like the Taklamakan. It's more of a cold steppe, rolling grasslands, scrub, patches of salty soil. To the south, snowy peaks. To the north, more open plains stretching toward Kazakhstan and western Mongolia. 3,500–4,000 years ago, this region was not empty. Archaeologists have pulled from this landscape the remains of people who look, genetically, very different from the Tarim mummies. These northern neighbours carried a heavy dose of what's called Western steppe herder ancestry, the kind associated with Bronze Age pastoralists who moved east out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, with their wagons, their horses, and their mobile herding economies. They are part of the same broad family as the famous Yamnaya and Andronovo cultures, though by the time we see them in Dzungaria, their material culture has its own local flavour. They bury their dead in kurgans, earthen or stone mounds, with grave goods that often include weapons, horse gear, and distinctive pottery styles that echo other steppe sites thousands of kilometers away. The DNA from these Jungarian individuals fits the expectation. A mix of Western steppe herder ancestry and some local Eastern components, more like what we see in early populations of northern China and Mongolia. In genetic plots, they sit in a completely different part of the map than the A&E heavy Tarim people. Yet geographically they're not far apart, just over those mountains, and it's not just the Tarim Basin. Ring the Tarim Basin, and you get a mosaic of different groups. In the mountain valleys of the Tian Shan and Kunlun ranges, you likely had small communities practicing mixed economies, herding sheep, goats, and perhaps yak or cattle in the high pastures in summer, retreating to lower, more sheltered areas in winter, and cultivating small plots where water was available. Further west, in what's now Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, steppe cultures with strong Western steppe herder ancestry were spreading eastward, experimenting with chariots, more complex metallurgy, and large herds. To the east and southeast, in the Hexi corridor and along the fringes of the Gobi, there were early farmers and mixed agropastoralists with roots in northern Chinese Neolithic cultures. Millet, and later wheat and barley, entered their crop packages. Their genetic profiles tilted more toward what we'd loosely call East Asian ancestry, blended with local steppe-related elements. And in between, in small river oases and along seasonal watercourses, there were likely communities that don't fit any neat label, people trading, intermarrying, adapting to whatever the land allowed. The Tarim Basin sits like a great sandy bowl in the middle of all this. Mountain walls on three sides, deadly desert in the centre, thin green ribbons of life around the rims. So how do you have a basin full of A&E rich people, with comparatively little mixing, sitting next to regions where steppe herders and early farmers are actively blending with each other? Part of the answer is geography, but part of it is how human interactions actually work. We tend to imagine contact as a binary. Either people are isolated or they're mixing freely. Reality is more like a gradient, with many different channels and intensities of interaction. Imagine three broad kinds of communities around the Tarim in the early 2nd millennium BCE. First, the mobile herders of the steppe and highland pastures. Their year has a rhythm, moving flocks to higher grass in summer, down to safer valleys in winter. They might have semi-permanent campsites, but they're not bound to a single plot of land. Their wealth is on the hoof. Second, the riverine and oasis farmers inside the Tarim. They're tethered to specific water sources, springs, river deltas, places where groundwater breaks the surface. They build irrigation channels, stake claims to fields, and invest in structures, storage pits, houses, walls. Their main risk is not finding grass. It's the river shifting course, or a drought drying up a spring. Third, what you could call interface communities. People who sit at the edges where steppe meets oasis, who might keep some animals, cultivate some plots, and make a living facilitating exchanges between the two worlds. They know the routes, they know both sets of languages and customs. They might be the ones who guide herders safely to a well, or who bring metal tools from the steppe to trade for grain and dried fruit. These three types of communities see each other. They trade, they argue, they probably intermarry sometimes. But the pattern of genetic mixing that results depends on who's moving where, who's allowed to marry whom, and how big each group is. From a genetic point of view, mixing leaves signatures that are surprisingly measurable. If you take the genomes of people from a given cemetery and find that they can only be explained as a combination of two or more different ancestral sources, say, a Western steppe herder-related source and an East Asian farmer-related source, that's a sign of admixture. If you then look at the genome as you move along each chromosome, you'll find long chunks that look like one ancestry and long chunks that look like the other. Over time, with each generation of recombination, those chunks get chopped into smaller pieces. Statistical methods can measure the average size of these ancestry segments and, in effect, count how many generations of shuffling have passed since the mixing event. That's how geneticists estimate the timing of admixture. More generations means more chopping, therefore smaller segments. When researchers applied these tools to Dzungarian and surrounding steppe populations, they found patterns consistent with active mixing during the Bronze Age. Western steppe herder ancestry, blending with local Siberian and East Asian related components, starting maybe around the mid-3rd to early 2nd millennium BCE, then continuing over centuries. But when they turned the same lens on the Tarim mummies from the key early cemeteries, that robust, obvious admixture signal just wasn't there. There are tiny hints, little traces of gene flow from neighbours, but nothing like the strong, recent mixing you see just over the mountains. It's not that the Tarim people lived in a bubble where no outsider ever set foot. It's that the kind of systematic, large-scale intermarriage that would have reshaped their genetic profile either didn't happen much or started later than in the steppe zones. That leaves room for several scenarios. One possibility is small-scale intermarriage at the boundaries. Perhaps a few western steppe herder-derived individuals married into Tarim oasis families each generation. Over time, their descendants would carry small fragments of steppe ancestry, noticeable at a fine scale, but not enough to dominate the overall picture. In practice, this might look like a caravan leader from the north settling down in an oasis after marrying the daughter of a local lineage head, or a herding family that loses its flocks in a bad year and takes up residence near a river, slowly merging into the farming community. Another possibility is that much of the contact was mediated through trade networks rather than mass movement of people. Goods, ideas, and techniques can travel much farther and faster than genes. A bronze knife from a steppe workshop might pass from herder to trader to oasis farmer, changing hands a dozen times without any of those people having children with one another. A weaving technique used to produce a particular pattern of plaid could be copied by local textile workers after seeing it once, with no genetic exchange at all. You can imagine seasonal movement as well. Steppe herders might bring their flocks down near the mountain mouths in winter, camping close to Tarim oases but not inside them. They'd trade meat and wool for grain and fruits, perhaps work out grazing rights. Young people might flirt across that economic boundary at festivals or markets, but if marriage rules and social boundaries were strict, only a few of those flirtations would translate into children, and social rules matter. Even in small populations, boundaries about who is marriageable can be powerful filters. A group that defines itself strongly around particular ancestors, rituals, or land rights may be much more likely to take spouses from neighbouring oases than from wandering herders, even if they see both groups regularly. That brings us to an important point. When we say the Tarim mummies, it's easy to imagine a single homogeneous people. But the cemeteries we've sampled so far are not all the same. Xiaohe, Gumugu, Beifang, and other sites differ in their burial customs, grave goods, and in some cases their genetic profiles. Some early Tarim cemeteries, like Xiaohe, show that strong ANE-derived signal with only faint whispers of outside ancestry. Others, especially from later periods or other oases, begin to show clearer signs of genetic input from steppe or eastern populations. In other words, we may not be looking at one Tarim people, but at a patchwork of related yet distinct communities scattered around the basin, each with its own microhistory of contact and isolation. One oasis might be a tight-knit endogamous group, marrying mostly within itself and fiercely guarding its water rights. Another might sit at a natural crossroads and act as a hub, with a more mixed population drawing in both ANE, rich desert dwellers, and people with steppe or farmer ancestry. Later, still other communities might be founded by immigrants from outside the basin altogether, Indo-European-speaking herders moving in from the northwest, or groups with stronger East Asian ancestry filtering in from the east, layering new genealogies onto the older ones. Genetics at its best makes you humble in the face of this diversity. When we look at the Dzungarian steppe and see western steppe herder-rich groups, and then look at early Tarim cemeteries and see ANE-heavy genomes with little mixing, it doesn't mean there was a hard cultural border drawn in the mountains. It means that for a time the patterns of who married whom and who settled where produced very different demographic outcomes on either side of that ridge. The steppe question for the Tarim mummies, then, isn't just, did steppe herders come in and replace the locals? For the early Bronze Age, the genetic answer seems to be not in any large, obvious way. The more nuanced questions are, where, when, and in which oases did steppe-derived genes enter? Did they come as isolated individuals plugging into long-standing NE-based communities, as small bands founding new settlements, or as gradual trickles that only become visible in the DNA centuries later? And parallel to that, How did steppe peoples themselves absorb ANE like Ancestry from older northern populations, long before the Tarim story even begins? Those questions link the desert mummies, the Dzungarian herders, and the wider steppe world into a single sprawling puzzle. To push that puzzle further, we have to look not just at who mixed with whom, but at how they lived, what they ate, what animals they kept, what plants they cultivated, and how the chemistry locked inside their bones and teeth lines up with the genetic story. If genetics lets us see who these people were related to, chemistry lets us see how they stayed alive. Inside every bone, every tooth, there's a quiet record of what you ate, where you drank, and sometimes even how far you moved in childhood. You just have to know which signals to read. Start with carbon. Plants fall into a few basic photosynthetic pathways. The important ones here are C3 and C4. Wheat, barley, most trees and temperate grasses are C3 plants. Millet and some warm-adapted grasses are C4. These different photosynthetic strategies fractionate carbon in slightly different ways. They end up with different ratios of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in their tissues. When humans eat those plants, or animals that fed on them, that isotopic accent gets built into our bones. So a person whose diet was heavy on wheat and barley will have a different carbon isotope signature than someone living mostly on millet porridge. If you throw in a lot of animal fat and dairy from herds grazing on steppe grass, that pushes the signal in another direction again. Now add nitrogen. Nitrogen isotopes tell you about position in the food chain. Plants sit at the base. Herbivores that eat those plants sit a step higher. Predators and humans who eat a lot of meat or dairy end up with nitrogen-15 ratios that are bumped up another notch. At a very rough level, more animal protein, higher nitrogen values. More plant-based, especially from low trophic plants like grains and some pulses, lower nitrogen values. Then there's strontium. Strontium is a stand-in for geology. Different rock types have different strontium isotope ratios. Rain and groundwater pick that up. Plants absorb it, animals eat the plants, and it ends up in teeth and bones. Crucially, the enamel of your first molar locks in its strontium signal in early childhood and never changes. Bone, on the other hand, remodels over your lifetime and gradually reflects where you spent your later years. So if your tooth enamel strontium matches the local groundwater where you're buried, you probably grew up there. If it doesn't, you're a migrant. Combine all three, carbon, nitrogen, strontium, and you get a three-dimensional snapshot. What a person was eating, how much animal versus plant food, and whether they were local or came from somewhere with different rocks and water. When researchers began applying these tools to the Tarim mummies and their neighbours, a pattern emerged that fit the genetic picture in some ways and challenged it in others. Take the early Tarim cemeteries like Xiaohe and Gumugu. The carbon isotope values from human bones and from animal remains suggest diets dominated by C3 plants, things like wheat and barley, rather than millet. That's already interesting because millet was widely cultivated in northern China, to the east, and in parts of the eastern steppe by this time. The Tarim people instead seem to have leaned heavily on crops with western origins, part of that old world crop package that moved east: wheat, barley, maybe peas, and other temperate plants. But the nitrogen signals aren't what you'd expect from sedentary farmers surviving on bread gruel alone. Many Tarim individuals show elevated nitrogen values, consistent with substantial animal protein in the diet. That could mean meat, but also dairy, milk, yogurt, cheese, maybe dried curds. When you add in the fact that the animal bones in these cemeteries often come from sheep, goats, and cattle, you start to see a mixed economy. Irrigated fields at the oasis edges, and herds grazing the sparse steppe and desert margins. Isotopes alone can't tell you that people were herding, but when you line them up with the faunal remains, sheep, goats, cattle, maybe horses, it points strongly toward it. The real clincher for dairying comes from a different kind of chemistry. On some of the pottery from Tarim sites, and on residues clinging to the insides of wooden vessels, researchers have analysed the fatty acids trapped in the pores of the material. These fats preserve a distinct isotopic pattern when they come from milk as opposed to meat. In multiple cases, the signal points clearly to dairy lipids, milk fats from ruminants. That means people weren't just killing animals for meat, They were milking them. You can imagine what that looked like on the ground. Early mornings at a Tarim oasis, women and men bringing ewes and cows in from their night enclosures, stripping milk into leather bags or wooden buckets. Some of that milk drunk fresh, some fermented into a sour yogurt-like drink, some heated and strained into curds that could be dried and stored. Dairy changes everything in an economy like this. An animal no longer gives you one big bolus of nutrition at slaughter. It becomes a renewable resource, producing calories day after day, year after year, as long as it's fed and kept healthy. And dairy knowledge rarely travels in isolation. The techniques to ferment milk, to separate curds and whey, to turn something that spoils in hours into something that lasts for weeks, that's a technical package. In many parts of Eurasia, that package traces back, culturally and archaeologically, to steppe herding traditions and to agro-pastoralists who moved along the mountain corridors. So when you find dairy in Tarim vessels, it suggests that, at minimum, ideas travelled between the desert oases and the steppe worlds to the north and west. It doesn't immediately mean large-scale migration, but it's a sign of technological contact. Plant remains refine the picture further. In the graves themselves, and in surrounding settlement layers where they survive, archaeologists have found charred grains and plant impressions, wheat, barley, sometimes broomcorn millet, along with seeds and fruit pits from local wild species. The wheat and barley most likely came down the Inner Asian mountain corridor, that long chain of highland valleys stretching from Central Asia toward the Tian Shan and Kunlun ranges. Their appearance in the Tarim Basin fits the broader story of west to east crop movement in the Bronze Age. Millet, when it shows up, tells a different story. That's a C4 crop with eastern roots, domesticated in northern China. Its presence in some Tarim contexts, often later, or in oases with more complex material culture, hints at east-west exchange as well. Alongside these cultivated grains, there's evidence of wild resources. Fruits from desert shrubs, perhaps wild grasses or steppe plants harvested seasonally, maybe reeds and rushes from the wet margins of oases used for mats, baskets, or even as emergency food. This is what an oasis adaptation looks like in practice. Fields where water can be diverted. Orchards or small groves of trees near springs. Herds pastured on the less hospitable ground beyond, turning scrub and sparse grass into milk and meat. Chemistry, in other words, shows us people who are not just scraping by in a desert, but engineering a fairly sophisticated mixed economy in a brutally constrained environment. Now bring strontium into the story. If the Tarim oases were constant crossroads for roaming herders and far-flung merchants, you might expect to find a lot of people whose childhood strontium signatures don't match local geology. In some steppe burials outside the basin, that's exactly what we see. A patchwork of locals and clear non-locals, individuals who were born hundreds of kilometres away and ended up buried far from their birthplace. That fits a picture of mobile herders moving across wide territories, of alliances and marriages linking distant groups. In the early Tarim cemeteries, though, the picture so far is different. Most analysed individuals have tooth enamel strontium values in line with the local water and rock baseline. They look like people who were born and raised in or very near the same oases where they were eventually buried. That dovetails with the genetic story. Little evidence for recent large-scale inflow of steppe or eastern farmer ancestry in the earliest Tarim mummies, and chemical signatures that say local upbringing. It doesn't mean no one ever moved in. Some individuals do show slightly off baseline values, hinting that they might have grown up in a nearby valley or on different rock formations. But we're not seeing a flood of long-distance migrants in the earliest phases. In later periods, as other oases develop and steppe-related or eastern ancestries become more common genetically, you start to see more complexity in the strontium data as well. That suggests that over centuries patterns of mobility and marriage changed. The basins may have opened up, or new groups may have taken root. This is where multiple lines of evidence start to talk to each other and occasionally argue. Imagine one scenario. You find a person in a Tarim cemetery whose DNA shows a clear chunk of Western steppe herder ancestry. On a genetic PCA plot, they pull a little toward the Tocharian clusters. Maybe they even have a Y chromosome lineage common among steppe herders. If their tooth enamel strontium matches the local oasis, that suggests they weren't a visiting steppe herder buried abroad. They were born there. Their steppe-derived ancestry came from a parent or grandparent who brought that genetic legacy in earlier and then settled, married, and raised children locally. If instead their enamel strontium is wildly different from the local baseline, matching, say, a known steppe region to the north, you're looking at something else. A first-generation migrant, someone who grew up on the steppe and ended their life in the desert. Flip the scenario. Suppose you have an individual whose genetics look purely ANE heavy, indistinguishable from other local Tarim people, but their tooth enamel strontium does not match the oasis rocks. They grew up somewhere else with similar ANE ancestry, perhaps another desert pocket, perhaps a different basin that hasn't yet been sampled genetically. That tells you gene pools can be spread across multiple ecological niches. An ANE-rich population might not be limited to the oases we've excavated. There could have been related groups scattered across the broader region, moving between patches of water and pasture, intermarrying just enough to share a genetic identity while living quite different day-to-day lives. When chemical and genetic signals line up, local ancestry, local strontium, local diet, it gives you confidence in the reconstruction. A mostly endogamous community, raising its own children, eating food from its own fields and herds. When they clash, say, a genetically local person with non-local strontium, or a steppe-looking genome with a purely oasis-style diet, it forces you to revise simple stories of farmers here, herders there, and think in terms of individuals with complex life histories. That's where the Tarim mummies really come alive. They're not just abstract points on a graph. They are people whose childhood water left a trace in their teeth, whose breakfast of flatbread and sour milk nudged the carbon and nitrogen in their bones, whose parents and grandparents carried ancestries inherited from hunter-gatherers who roamed Ice Age Siberia and from pastoralists and farmers pushing along the mountain corridors. The remarkable thing is how often the lines converge. For the earliest Tarim cemeteries, the genetics, the isotopes, the plant remains, and the animal bones all tell a broadly consistent story. Communities rooted in place, tapping oasis water to grow Western-derived crops, herding livestock for meat, and especially dairy, and yet, for a time, remaining genetically distinct from the steppe herders and farmers surrounding them. The disagreements, the little mismatches, are just as valuable. They're the anomalies that hint at visiting traders, runaway herders, marriages across boundaries, or even entirely unsampled populations lurking in the archaeological shadows. And as we're about to see, another chemical factor, one not about diet at all, played a huge role in why these people's bodies, clothes, and even last meals survived for us to study in the first place. To understand why these people's faces still look back at us 3,500 years later, you have to think less like a geneticist and more like a mortician, and a geologist, and a microbiologist. Because most of the time, the default fate of a human body is simple. It disappears. Flesh is food. Bacteria, fungi, insects, scavengers, even plant roots all compete for that sudden nutrient-rich package you leave behind. In a temperate, moist environment, an untreated body can be reduced to bone in a matter of years. Give it a few decades, and even those bones start to soften, crack, dissolve. The fact that the Tarim mummies look like people who could get up and walk away is not normal. It's the result of a very specific convergence of environment and behaviour. Start with the environment. The Tarim Basin is one of the driest places on Earth. In the heart of the basin, annual rainfall can be less than an inch. There are oases, pockets where meltwater from distant mountains fans out and briefly creates life. But step away from those and you're in a landscape that is almost aggressively dead. That dryness matters because decay is, at its core, a wet process. Most of the microbes that break down soft tissue are operating in water films, in pores along moist surfaces. Give them desiccation, take away their water, and they go dormant or die. Enzymatic reactions slow to a crawl. The chain of decomposition is interrupted. Now add salt. In several Tarim cemeteries, the soil is rich in soluble salts and other mineral deposits. Groundwater that rises and evaporates leaves behind crusts and layers of salts in the sediment. Archaeologists digging at sites like Xiaohe talk about the ground itself tasting brackish, alkaline, harsh. Salt is a preservative for the same reason it's been used in food storage for millennia. It pulls water out of tissues and out of microbial cells, creating an osmotic environment that most bacteria can't tolerate. High salinity turns a fresh piece of meat into something closer to jerky. It doesn't make decay impossible, but it makes it very slow. Then there's the wind. The Tarim Desert is not a still, silent sandbox. It's an active, abrasive system. Strong, dry winds scour the surface, stripping away any moisture that dares to linger. In life, that wind would have been miserable, blowing sand into eyes, chapping skin, drying out crops. In death, it's part of the mummification machine. At several cemeteries, the graves are shallow, sometimes less than a metre deep, and capped with porous materials. The result is like a low-tech dehydrator. Air can move in and out, moisture can escape. The body dries before putrefactive bacteria get a chance to liquefy it. But here's the key point. Environment alone wasn't enough. People helped the desert along. Look at the burial practice. Many of the most famous Tarim mummies were not just dropped in holes. They were placed in wooden coffins, wrapped in textiles, sometimes bundled with additional organic materials like reeds, felt, leather, and fur. Those coffins, especially the iconic boat-shaped ones at Xiaohe, did more than look dramatic. They created a controlled microenvironment around the corpse. A wooden coffin is a moisture buffer. In a place where the soil can be salty and chemically aggressive, wood intervenes. It slows the direct contact between flesh and sediment. It reduces rapid swings in humidity and temperature right at the body surface. It gives drying a head start. Textiles and wrappings add another layer of control. The Tarim people were extraordinary textile workers. Some mummies are wrapped in multiple layers of wool, felt, and woven cloth. That fabric does at least three things. First, it physically protects the skin from abrasion and direct insect activity. Second, it acts like a wick, drawing fluids away from the body into the surrounding fibres where they can evaporate more easily. Third, it creates thin air spaces that facilitate slow, steady airflow instead of trapping pockets of stagnant, humid air that would favour rot. Even the details that look ceremonial can have preservation consequences. Some bodies have caps, felt hats, boots, or leather shoes. Others have faces covered with masks or coated in substances that might have had symbolic meaning. These coverings protect delicate features, the nose, cheeks, lips, from mechanical damage and from rapid desiccation that can cause cracking and collapse. Layer all of this, salt, dryness, wind, coffins, wrappings, and what you get is essentially a low-temperature, low-oxygen freeze-drying system, operating not in a lab, but in a Bronze Age cemetery. Microbiology fills in the rest of the picture. Early in decomposition, the gut microbiome plays a starring role. After death, the bacteria that lived peacefully in your intestines for decades suddenly have no immune system keeping them in check. They start digesting outward, through the gut wall into surrounding tissues. Gases build up, pressure increases, and the body bloats. This is the beginning of the classic messy part of decay. In a hot, dry, saline context like the Tarim Basin graves, that normal progression can be cut short. If water is pulled out of the gut wall quickly enough, if salts penetrate the tissues, if the ambient temperature cycles between cold desert nights and hot days, the microbes get hammered from several directions. Many species simply cannot maintain their cell integrity. They lyse, they sporulate, or they become inactive. Fungi and insects face similar constraints. Without enough moisture, larvae can't develop properly. Fungal hyphae struggle to spread. Even scavenging mammals may be deterred by the harsh chemistry of the soil and the physical barriers of coffins and wrappings. What's fascinating is that this process is not uniform, even within a single cemetery. Some bodies at Tarim sites are spectacularly preserved. Others, just a few meters away, have collapsed faces, missing limbs, or are reduced mostly to skeletons. Same culture, same general environment, different outcomes. Why? Small differences matter. A grave dug 20 centimeters deeper might intercept a slightly wetter layer of sediment, or sit closer to a fluctuating water table. A coffin with a crack might admit more insects. A body buried in early spring might go through a different initial temperature and humidity regime than one buried in late autumn. Even orientation can play a role. If prevailing winds dry one side of a cemetery more efficiently than another, or if sun exposure differs, you can get local microclimates within the graveyard. On top of that, the state of the body at burial matters. Someone who died of a wasting disease, already dehydrated with lower body fat, may desiccate differently from a person who died suddenly, with a full gut and higher fat reserves. Children and infants, with different body proportions and tissue compositions, will have different decomposition dynamics than robust adults. From a microbiologist's perspective, each grave is an experimental microcosm, slightly different starting conditions, slightly different community of microbes, slightly different trajectory. Some of those trajectories end in near total loss of soft tissue. Others hit a sweet spot where tissues dry just fast enough to halt decay but not so fast that they shatter. This unevenness has a big consequence for how we interpret the past. When you look at glossy photos of the Tarim mummies, it's easy to forget that they are not a complete sample of everyone who lived in those communities. They are the survivors of a preservation lottery. If certain parts of the cemetery had better preservational conditions, slightly saltier soil, shallower water table, more airflow, then the individuals buried there are overrepresented in our visual and scientific record. If higher status people were preferentially buried in those prime spots, or given more elaborate coffins and wrappings, then elite bodies might preserve better than those of commoners. That means the faces we see in museums and in documentaries may be to some extent the faces of those who were buried with better technology, more care, or in luckier ground. There's another bias: age and sex. Robust adult bodies with thicker bones and connective tissues are more likely to leave substantial remains than fragile infants or elderly individuals with osteoporotic skeletons. If preservation favours one demographic over another, then our genetic and chemical samples will skew toward that group. We might end up knowing much more about the diets and ancestries of adult women, for example, than of small children, simply because more of the former survived well enough to sample. So when we say, the Tarim people ate this, or they looked like that, we're often, in practice, describing the Tarim individuals whose remains happen to preserve well enough for us to analyse. And even for those individuals, the preservation, as miraculous as it looks, is not perfect. Mummification in a desert coffin is not the same as freezing a person in liquid nitrogen. Over thousands of years, DNA strands fragment, proteins cross-link and denature, lipids oxidize, some tissues shrink or shift, pulling features out of their original positions. That beautifully preserved face might not tell you the exact skin tone the person had in life. Pigments that derive from melanin or hemoglobin can change or vanish. Hair colour can darken or lighten with time and chemical alteration. Tattoos, if they existed, may have faded beyond recognition. Internal organs often fare even worse. In some Tarim mummies, the brain shrivels into a small dry mass. In others, viscera are reduced to indistinct sludge, or are gone entirely. That makes it incredibly difficult to reconstruct cause of death in most cases. Did someone die of an infection, a heart problem, childbirth complications, a violent injury that didn't leave clear skeletal traces? The mummy often can't tell us. We also have almost no direct access to soft tissue pathologies like cancers in early stages, many autoimmune conditions, or subtle metabolic diseases. Bones and teeth carry some markers: growth disruptions, healed fractures, dental caries, but the rich internal medical story of these people is mostly lost. Even diet, which we can glimpse through stomach contents in a few extraordinary cases, is mostly constructed indirectly. A last meal of millet porridge, or wheat bread, or mutton stew, if preserved in the gut, tells you about one day, not a lifetime. Isotopes and residues fill in the broader pattern, but there will always be foods that leave faint or ambiguous traces. And then there are the intangibles: voices, gestures, the exact timbre of laughter, the way someone's hair moved in the wind, the colour of the thread spun from a plant dye that has since faded to beige. No amount of preservation returns those. So when we stand in front of a Tarim mummy and feel that uncanny sense of connection, it looks like a sleeping person. That feeling is both justified and misleading. Justified because the desert, the salt, the wind, and the careful work of Bronze Age mourners have conspired to bridge an almost unimaginable gulf of time. Misleading, because what we're seeing is a curated, filtered, chemically altered version of a life that was once full, warm, and in motion. The preservation is good enough to give us DNA that points to an ancient ghost population, proteins that hint at dairy consumption, fibers that reveal complex textile traditions, and even lice that suggest grooming habits. But it's not good enough to tell us with certainty how these people sounded when they spoke to their children, what stories they told about the desert wind, or which fears kept them awake at night. For that, we're still guessing, guided by comparisons, by patterns in other cultures, by the faint echoes preserved in later languages and myths. The Tarim mummies survived because geology, climate, biology, and human ritual lined up in a way that almost never happens. They are a gift of conditions as much as of culture. And as we move into the last part of the story, we have to hold two truths at once. They show us more than almost any Bronze Age population, and yet they still leave some of the most haunting questions unanswered. When the first DNA headlines came out, people didn't read the fine print. They saw phrases like "no known population on Earth" and "previously unknown lineage," and the story practically wrote itself. Lost civilization in the desert, mysterious strangers who appeared out of nowhere, maybe survivors of Atlantis, or refugees from some vanished advanced culture. You can still find those claims everywhere. Articles insisting the Tarim mummies prove Europeans reached China thousands of years before history. Videos arguing they were Aryan conquerors who brought civilization to a backward east. Conspiracy forums suggesting they were not quite human at all. They all have the same pattern. They take a real mystery and then sprint far past the evidence. Start with that headline phrase, "matched no known population." In an ancient DNA paper, that doesn't mean these people were aliens or scientists have never seen anything remotely like this before. It usually means something much more technical and much less dramatic. Imagine you're assembling a family tree, but almost all your living relatives died in a fire and took the photo albums with them. You have a handful of snapshots from distant cousins, some grainy pictures from great-grandparents, and one really clear portrait of a person you don't recognize. When you run the facial recognition software, no one in your database is a close match. The algorithms say, this face does not match any known individual. That doesn't mean the person came from another planet. It means your database is incomplete. Ancient DNA is like that, but worse. For most of human history, we have no genomes at all. No samples from millions of people who lived and died with no bones preserved, no graves yet excavated, no sequencing ever done. Against that enormous emptiness, the Tarim mummies stand out because they preserved well enough to test. When researchers said their genomes did not match any known living population, they were really saying, these people don't look like they're directly ancestral to any group we've sampled today, and they don't fit neatly into the known branches we've mapped so far. They're close to a very old branch that split off early, related to those ancient North Eurasians from Siberia. They're more pure representatives of that branch than anyone else we've tested. But think about what that implies. It doesn't mean they were utterly unique beings. It means they are the visible tip of a much larger iceberg of populations that once existed and are now gone or heavily mixed. A ghost lineage, not a magical one. That hasn't stopped people from trying to recruit them into all sorts of narratives. Some Western writers, especially in the early 20th century, leaned hard on how European some of the mummies looked to them. Light brown or reddish hair on a few individuals, deep eye sockets, long noses, burials with woolen textiles that reminded them of steppe cultures further west. From that they spun a whole story. Tall, noble Indo-Europeans pushing civilization eastward, bringing bronze and horses to an otherwise empty desert. In their version, the Tarim Basin was a proving ground for superior outsiders. There are several problems with this. First, the genetics don't support it. Those early Indo-European steppe pastoralists, the Amnielite groups and their descendants, have a very particular blend of ancestry. The Tarim mummies don't have that blend. They have the old, deep, ancient North Eurasian component, plus traces from their eastern neighbours, but they are missing the later steppe package that defines many Indo-European expansions. Second, appearance isn't ancestry. Hair colour can change with age, with burial conditions, with chemistry. A person with lighter hair is not automatically European in any modern sense. Facial features vary widely within and between populations, and the people writing those early descriptions brought their own biases to the table. They were primed to see familiar features as European and unfamiliar ones as other. Third, mapping 19th and 20th century racial ideas onto the Bronze Age is fundamentally misleading. The categories we use now, European, Asian, Middle Eastern, are recent political and cultural constructs sitting on top of incredibly tangled genetic histories. The Tarim people lived long before those labels meant anything. They were just themselves. On the other extreme, some modern responses push back by saying, well then, they must have been exactly like later local groups, just misinterpreted by outsiders. But the genetics won't let us flatten them into that either. They were genuinely different. Not in a mystical way, but in a deep time way. Their closest ancestry line goes back to people who roamed Ice Age Eurasia and then disappeared as other groups mingled and replaced them. For a long span, the Tarim Basin communities carried that signal with relatively little mixing, even as steppe herders passed nearby and farmers expanded east and west. So we're left in an awkward middle. They were not Europeans secretly living in China. They were not Atlanteans or visitors from beyond the stars. But they also weren't just interchangeable with the later Silk Road populations that eventually filled the same landscapes. They were their own thread in the human tapestry, one that frayed and ended. That leaves some very real open questions, places where the story genuinely is unfinished. First, origins. How did a group with such strong ancient North Eurasian ancestry end up nested in this harsh desert basin at exactly this time? One possibility is that they were the descendants of local foragers who had been in the broader region since the late Ice Age, gradually adapting to oasis life as climate and rivers shifted. In that scenario, the Tarim Basin is less an isolated island and more a refuge, a pocket where an old lineage managed to hang on. Another possibility is that they moved in from the north or northeast, following river corridors down off the plateau or out of the mountains, bringing with them desert oasis know-how, and then becoming increasingly isolated. Right now, the genetic evidence can't cleanly distinguish between these variants. We don't have enough ancient genomes from all the regions around the basin at all the relevant times. There are big gaps on the map. Second, cultural transmission. Even if their genes looked ancient and somewhat isolated, their material culture didn't sit in a vacuum. We see wheat and barley in their diets, crops with origins far to the west. We see millet, more characteristic of the east. We see dairy, which connects to pastoral traditions that spread across the steppe. We see textile patterns and burial features that echo, faintly, practices in very distant regions. So how did people who were relatively genetically distinct end up plugged into these wide networks of ideas and objects? You can pass a seed without passing a genome. A handful of traders stopping at an oasis can leave behind a crop, a style of dress, a word for horse, without leaving much measurable ancestry in the local gene pool. Low-level movement over centuries can reshape technology and belief, while leaving the core population structure looking surprisingly stable. But we don't yet know the details of that process here. Were the Tarim communities actively trading along proto-silk routes? Did they send their own people out and bring spouses back? Or were they more like semi-closed groups who occasionally adopted profitable tricks from passing neighbours? Third, why did their isolation persist as long as it did? By the late 2nd millennium BCE, the steppe was a highway. People, animals, language families and diseases were all on the move. In many parts of Eurasia, that mobility left clear genetic footprints, mixtures that show up in bones and teeth. In the Tarim Basin, at least in the earliest mummies, that wave seems to break at the shore and then recede. The expected steppe signal is mostly missing. Maybe the desert was a more effective barrier than we tend to imagine from looking at modern maps. Maybe oasis communities controlled access sharply, regulating who could marry in and who could not. Maybe environmental stress made groups less willing to dilute what they saw as precious kin ties. Or maybe we simply haven't yet sampled the individuals who did show more mixing. And that brings us to another uncomfortable reality. Our picture can still change. All the sweeping statements you've heard about the Tarim mummies, that they were this, that they weren't that, rest on a pretty small number of genomes from a handful of cemeteries, mostly dating to particular centuries. Each new excavation has the potential to complicate the story. Dig at a slightly later cemetery along the same river, and you might suddenly see more steppe ancestry washing in. Sample infants instead of adults, and you might notice patterns of who was being born to whom that don't show up in the preserved elite. Sequence people from a different oasis, and the genetic profile might lean more toward neighbouring farmers. Ancient DNA is notorious for overturning neat models every few years. We thought one thing about Europe's prehistory, then a new batch of genomes rewrote it. We thought we understood the peopling of the Americas, then a single skeleton shifted the timelines. There's no guarantee the Tarim story we're telling now will be the one we're telling in 20 years. Beneath all of this is a final, very modern layer: ethics and identity. These aren't just scientific specimens. They were people, buried with care, whose descendants, genetic or cultural, may still live in the region. When early explorers hauled mummies out of the desert and into foreign museums, they were not thinking about how those bodies would be used a century later in arguments over who belongs where. They didn't foresee the way photos of light-haired mummies would be wielded to claim that certain modern populations have deeper, more legitimate roots than others. Now communities in Xinjiang and beyond are paying attention. For some, the mummies are potential ancestors, part of a deep local heritage that complicates simple narratives of arrival and replacement. For others, they're symbols misused to justify modern politics. Proof, supposedly, that one group or another has an ancient right to the land. Scientists are caught in the middle. On one side, there is the drive to extract as much information as possible, sequence more genomes, sample more bone, slice thinner histological sections. On the other, there is a growing recognition that these are human remains tied to living people's sense of self and history. Who gets to decide what happens to a mummy? Who has a say in whether it's displayed, sampled, reburied? How do you share results in ways that don't fuel racist fantasies or nationalist propaganda? Those questions don't have easy answers, but they shape the research now in a way they didn't when the first coffins were opened. So when you hear that the Tarim mummies matched no known population, it's worth translating that statement properly. It means, in a world where most ancient genomes are still missing, these people preserve a signal from a branch of humanity we'd only glimpsed before. It means they challenge our tidy maps of who moved where and when. It means there are still whole chapters of human history that we've barely started to read. What it doesn't mean is that they were outsiders dropped into the desert as a puzzle for us to solve. They were insiders to their own world, speaking languages we may never fully reconstruct, telling stories that never got written down, raising children who would grow up surrounded by salt wind and starlight. We can argue about origins and isolation and migration patterns. We can refine models and redraw arrows on maps as new data arrives. But behind every theory, sensible or wild, there are still those quiet, durable facts. A body wrapped with care, a face turned toward an unforgiving sky, and a desert that held on to them long enough for us to ask and keep asking who they were. When you pull back from the specific graves and datasets, the strangest thing about the Tarim mummies is that they force us to reframe what counts as normal in human history. They are not an impossible people who popped into existence and then vanished in a puff of mystery. They are something at once less romantic and more profound. A rare, almost freakishly well-preserved survival of an ancient lineage that usually only shows up as statistical noise. Most of the time when geneticists talk about those Ice Age populations, ancient North Eurasians, ancient East Asians, early West Eurasians, they're dealing with something closer to ghosts than to people. You see their fingerprints faintly, in low percentages, 10% here, 20% there, a stray signal in a hunter-gatherer from Europe, a whisper in a Bronze Age herder from the steppe, a faint echo in some indigenous groups in the Americas. You run models, adjust admixture graphs, and you get used to treating these ancestors as abstractions. Necessary components that make the equations balance. And then suddenly, in the Tarim Basin, you meet them almost face to face. Instead of a 10% echo, you get communities that are mostly built from that ancient branch. Instead of a footnote in a methods section, you have entire families who carried that deep ancestry as their primary inheritance for centuries. The mummies don't tell us that a lost civilization appeared in the desert. They tell us that the Ice Age never really ended in the way we sometimes imagine. Not for climate, those glaciers retreated, but for population structure. If you picture the end of the last Ice Age as a neat transition, with old groups dissolving and new, mixed populations sweeping across continents, the Tarim mummies are a reminder that history didn't play out that cleanly. Some lineages didn't just blend into the background and disappear. They retreated into pockets, refugees, corners where geography and chance let them persist. The Tarim Basin looks, on a modern map, like an empty tan smudge ringed by mountains. But in population terms it behaved like a time capsule. As herders and farmers and traders crisscrossed Eurasia, swapping genes, technologies and pathogens, the people in these oases kept a much older genetic profile than most of their neighbours. They were living in the Bronze Age with a genome that pointed back toward the late Pleistocene. That has big implications for how we picture Eurasia across tens of thousands of years. We often draw migrations as clean arrows, out of Africa, into the Near East, across the steppe, down into South Asia, east into the Americas. Each arrow labelled with a culture name or language family, each boundary suggesting a tidy replacement. But behind those arrows were countless smaller movements, dead ends, local survivals. The Tarim mummies suggest that ancient North Eurasian-related groups didn't just vanish when other populations expanded. They likely occupied broad swathes of northern and central Eurasia for millennia, sometimes as dominant groups, sometimes as minorities, sometimes as isolated pockets clinging to river valleys and basins. The people whose DNA we see so clearly in the Tarim Basin may have had cousins in forests in tundra, along other inland seas. Most of those cousins left no mummified bodies in perfect desert sand. Their bones decayed in damp soils, their graves eroded, their stories never encountered a backhoe or an archaeologist. So we're left with a biased sample, a few preserved islands in an ocean of loss. That brings us to the other uncomfortable lesson the Tarim mummies carry. Deserts don't just preserve bodies, they preserve missing chapters. If you only looked where preservation is good, hyper-arid basins, frozen tundra, high caves, you might convince yourself that those places were unusually important in human history. It's where we find intact textiles, uncollapsed wooden coffins, hair, skin, even last meals. But that's partly an illusion. We learn so much from the Tarim Basin because the desert is kind to the dead. It desiccates, it seals, it keeps bacteria in check. Wood, leather, woven wool, even the microbiome of a gut can survive long enough for modern tools to interrogate them. Imagine if soils in temperate Europe or monsoon Asia did the same. Imagine if, instead of a few rare, waterlogged bog bodies or carefully curated tombs, we had thousands of everyday burials intact, across 5,000 years. Whole sections of prehistory that now look blank or fuzzy would suddenly come into focus. The Tarim mummies are a reminder that our historical map looks patchy, not because nothing was happening in the blank zones, but because preservation is uneven and excavation is incomplete. Deserts, ice, and bogs are like accidental archivists. They decide which stories we get to read first. We have to be careful not to mistake the best preserved for the most important. What the Tarim evidence really suggests is that there were probably many other pockets of deep-time lineages across Eurasia. Groups who held onto older genetic patterns while adopting new crops, tools, and ideas. We just haven't found their cemeteries in such spectacular condition yet, or their bones haven't yielded DNA, or local circumstances mean we can't study them in the same way. That's why any grand conclusion about these mummies has to come with a built-in dose of humility. The evidence we have is strong for what it actually shows. We can say with confidence that early Tarim Basin individuals so far sequenced carry overwhelmingly ancient North Eurasian-related ancestry, with surprisingly little input from contemporaneous steppe pastoralists or neighbouring farmers. We can say they were engaged with broader cultural networks, adopting crops and techniques that originated far away. We can say their genetic profile doesn't match any living population one-to-one, and that in that sense they represent a now extinct configuration. Those are sturdy findings, replicated across multiple labs and analytic approaches. But beyond that, the picture blurs. Exactly where their ancestors lived during the coldest pulses of the Ice Age. Still debated. Exactly how they moved into the basin and how many different waves there were. Not settled. Exactly when and how their distinct genetic signature faded as later Silk Road populations spread and mixed across the region. We're only beginning to sketch that. Even the neat phrases, isolated, unmixed, refuge population, hide messy realities that future data will almost certainly complicate. Maybe new graves from a slightly later century will show more steppe ancestry. Maybe an overlooked skeleton in a museum storage room will turn out to be an earlier representative of the same lineage from hundreds of kilometers away. Maybe genomes from neighboring mountain valleys will reveal that what looks like a singular refuge was actually one knot in a much larger web. History at this timescale is less like a final printed book and more like a draft with notes scribbled in the margins. The Tarim Mummies are one of the clearer paragraphs we can read right now, but we shouldn't mistake them for the whole story. Still, even draft pages can change how you think about the plot. If an Ice Age-related lineage could persist in the Tarim Basin, largely intact into the Bronze Age, then similar survivals might have shaped other regions in ways we haven't recognized yet. The genetic background in which Indo-European languages spread, or in which early farming took hold, or in which the Silk Road later wove its mesh of roots, might have been far more diverse in deep ancestry than simplified models imply. Instead of a few large, clean migrations, picture layers of older groups, some long established, some newly arrived, negotiating space, exchanging spouses, trading seeds and stories, sometimes merging, sometimes holding themselves apart for generations. The Tarim Mummies show us one such layer that didn't get fully overwritten before the desert sealed it up. They're a fossil of population structure, but they're also a fossil of choice. Groups can, under the right conditions, maintain distinct identities and kin networks even when surrounded by movement and change. To bring that down from the scale of graphs and maps, it helps to imagine something more personal. Picture a child born in one of those Tarim oases about 3,800 years ago. Her genetic code is carrying a heavy load of ancestry from people who hunted mammoths and reindeer on glacial plains thousands of years before her. She doesn't know that, of course. She knows irrigation channels, sheep, fermented dairy, the feel of wool against her skin. She grows up hearing stories about visitors from the mountains, about caravans that sometimes appear on the horizon bringing strange metals or beads or grains. She may never travel more than a few days' walk from her home, but through traded goods and borrowed words she touches a world that spans from the Near East to the Yellow River. To us looking back, she's a data point, an individual whose genome we might sequence, whose teeth we might test for isotopes. To her, she's simply part of a chain, parents, grandparents, future children, anchored in that harsh, luminous landscape. Now imagine that somewhere far away, in another basin, another refuge, another child is living a parallel life, carrying a different old lineage forward in time. We may never find her bones. Her people may leave no spectacular mummies. But they were part of the same human experiment. How long can a thread from the deep past remain recognizable as the loom of history keeps weaving? That's the thought experiment the Tarim Mummies quietly invite. When you look at a modern population, a city crowd, a village, your own family, how many such threads are still there, faint but unbroken? How many ancient lineages persist not as pure blocks like the Tarim profile, but as thin strands braided into our genomes, invisible until someone centuries from now develops the tools to notice. And if deserts can hold on to one chapter of that story for 4,000 years, what other chapters are still buried in places we haven't thought to dig, or in remains we haven't yet learned how to read? Those are the questions that turn a set of mummified bodies in a remote basin into something much larger than a local curiosity. They become mirrors held up to the whole of human history, reflecting not a single, mysterious people, but a reminder that most of who we were is still out there in fragments, waiting for us to learn how to see it. So where does that leave us? If you strip away the headlines, the no match on earth drama, what we have right now is a cautious, working interpretation. The early Tarim Basin communities we've talked about look, genetically, like one of the clearest survivals of that ancient North Eurasian-related lineage anyone has ever seen. Not untouched, not magically frozen in time, but heavily weighted toward a branch of the human family tree that, almost everywhere else, survives only as a trace. At the same time, their lives were anything but isolated in a cultural sense. They were growing crops that started out thousands of kilometers away. They were herding animals whose domestication stories span half of Eurasia. They were weaving textiles with techniques that echo steppe cultures, storing grain in ways that would make sense to farmers far to the west and east, and eventually living in a landscape that became one of the great crossroads of the ancient world. So the simplest, most supported picture looks something like this. A population carrying deep Ice Age-related ancestry ends up in or near the Tarim Basin. Maybe they're already there when farming and herding begin to reshape Eurasia. Maybe they move in and settle around those oases as the desert becomes more extreme. Either way, they manage for several centuries to keep a distinctive genetic profile while tapping into wider technological and economic networks. They're not aliens. They're not a lost civilization in the sci-fi sense. They're a local chapter of a very old human story that happens to have been filed in a desert archive instead of being shredded by time. That's the core interpretation most researchers would be comfortable standing behind today. But even that summary comes with a quiet asterisk, as far as we know right now. Because every part of that story hides questions we don't have solid answers to yet. We don't really know where the deeper roots of that ancient North Eurasian-like ancestry were during the worst glacial periods. Somewhere in northern Eurasia, yes. But was it a single homeland? A string of refuges at different times? Did groups drift north and south with the ice? Or were there stable pockets that acted as long-term anchors? We don't know when, exactly, the ancestors of the Tarim mummies started crystallizing into something that would eventually look like their group. Was that process already far along by the time they appear in our record? Or are we catching them midstream, partway through a longer series of fusions and splits? We don't know how they imagined themselves. Did they see sharp boundaries between us in the basin and them in the surrounding mountains and grasslands? Did they marry far afield and bring in spouses from multiple directions while still passing down a strong sense of continuity? Did they hold origin myths that pointed back to some other valley, some other sea, some other world of ice and rivers they'd never actually seen? The bones and the genomes can only hint at that. Even the sentence, "they were genetically isolated," is really just a placeholder for more careful questions. Isolated from whom exactly? For how long? Were they avoiding marriage partners from certain neighbouring groups? Were the neighbouring groups themselves changing so fast that even a modest rate of outside marriages would still leave the Tarim profile looking unmixed by comparison? Future data could redraw that boundary in a way that will make our current language look clumsy. And then there's the timeline problem. We've talked mostly about the earlier Tarim burials, the ones that turned up in those famous boat coffins with their felt hats and woolen cloaks. But what happened in the centuries after those people died? How gradually did their distinctive genetic profile dissolve as new waves of herders, farmers and later Silk Road communities wash through the region? Did it vanish quietly in a few generations of intermarriage? Did some pockets hang on much longer than others? Are there late, out-of-the-way cemeteries still sitting in the sand that would show us the final chapters of that lineage? Right now, The later phases of the story look more like scattered dots than a clear path. A few sites here, a few individuals there, some with more input from steppe groups, some with more from farming populations to the east or west. Enough to say, the basin became much more mixed over time, but not enough to trace the change decade by decade, or oasis by oasis. And that, in a way, brings us full circle to the hook we started with. That early no match to any known population headline sounded like a brick wall, as if science had thrown up its hands and admitted defeat, as if these people were so strange, so out of place that they broke the system. What's actually happened is almost the opposite. The attempt to figure out why they didn't match modern groups one-to-one forced researchers to build better tools, gather more comparative data, and think harder about what matching even means in deep time. The result is not a single neat answer, but a richer sense of how diverse ancient Eurasia really was. It turned out that the mummies weren't a glitch in the matrix. They were a reminder that our reference panel for human variation is skewed toward the present, and toward regions where preservation and politics happen to cooperate. Once you accept that, no match stops meaning mystical and starts meaning we're missing archives. We're missing the cemeteries of other refuges that never dried out. We're missing the genomes of groups whose bones crumbled before we had the technology to read them. We're missing the everyday burials under modern cities, farms and roads that no one will ever dig up. The Tarim Basin just happened to align three things at once: an unusual genetic history, a preservative desert, and a modern global interest in ancient DNA. That intersection cracked open a window, and now the question is how far we're willing to push it. Because the next steps aren't just technical, they're also ethical and political. Which ancient communities get sampled? Who decides which skeletons are research material and which are ancestors who should be left alone? How do present-day groups with cultural or geographic ties to these burials feel about scientists grinding up teeth and bones for DNA? Those are not side issues. They'll shape what questions we're allowed to ask and what kinds of answers we'll be able to find. So when we say, these are the unanswered questions we'll chase next, it's not just about plotting more dots on a map. It's about piecing together where those ancient North Eurasian-like groups really lived and moved over tens of thousands of years. It's about figuring out how many other Tarim-like survivals there might have been, small stubborn pockets of deep ancestry hiding in unexpected places. It's about learning whether the spread of big cultural systems, like the earliest Silk Road networks or the expansions of steppe herders, really swept away what was there before, or whether they flowed around older communities the way rivers curve around bedrock. And at a more personal level, it's about asking how many of those old threads still run quietly through the genomes of living people, unnoticed, because they don't fit the convenient categories on our charts. As more sites are studied, more genomes sequenced, and more local scholars and communities take the lead on research in their own regions, we'll be able to test these ideas. Some of today's best guesses will survive, others will be overturned. New puzzles will appear. That's the real fun of this kind of story. It doesn't end with a final reveal. It keeps expanding outward. So I'm curious. Now that you've heard the long version, what's your theory? Do you picture the Tarim mummies as the last clear echo of a much larger Ice Age world? Do you think we'll find their cousins in other deserts or mountain basins? Or did something else in their story surprise you more? Their diet, their clothes, the way their genes and culture moved at different speeds? Tell me in the comments what you think is really going on here, or which part of this journey changed how you imagine ancient Eurasia. And while you're down there, let me ask you for a favour that actually helps a lot. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a very strange corner of human history, tap like so more people see it, drop a comment and subscribe if you want to follow along as we explore the next mystery. That simple trio, like comment, subscribe, really does make it possible to keep making videos at this level of detail. One more thing I'd love to know, because it's always fascinating to see who's on the other side of the screen. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it for you? Are you in a city that once sat on the old Silk Road routes watching this late at night? On the other side of the world, catching this over breakfast? Somewhere in between, on a bus, in a lab, on a farm? Drop your location and the local time in the comments, along with your theory or the moment that stuck with you most. Somewhere in that list of places and time zones will be descendants of people who traded across these same landscapes, or who carry faint traces of the same ancient lineages in their DNA without ever knowing it. And as we piece together their stories from deserts and bones and statistics, you'll be right here at the edge of what we know, watching the next pages get written.